Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Babble on Babylon. We are going to be talking about Season 4 today. If you've seen this before, you know the drill. If you haven't, why have you not watched Babble on Babylon Seasons 1 through 3? Joining me again is Jonas Kiratzis, and, I feel like at this point I should just let you say the name, or I should intentionally pronounce it as bad as possible, like Kairat Zays or something like this, because I think we've hit the limits of my pronunciation.
My favorite version I've still ever seen is Joseph Kiranzis,
Okay,
who I claim is like an alternate. He is my identical twin cousin.
that's awesome. when you want to do some kind of pseudonymous work, like you want to have like a ghost name or a ghost
after
I
get canceled.
Yes,
yeah.
then you can return as the as Joseph. What's the last name? Joseph what?
Kiranzis.
Joseph Kiranzis.
Yeah.
So Babylon Season 4, we left off, so seasons, just to recap, Seasons 1 and 2, I thought Season 1 was very good. I thought Season 2, I'll have to watch it again, but it may be one of my favorite seasons in television. Modulo the fact that this is not a high-budget show, if you just factor in, like, what did you have to work with, I thought it was probably one of my favorites. So I went, like, 1 was pretty good, 2 was excellent. 3, I was like, on, but you were not. You thought 3 was actually strong. I think you actually thought it was like 1, 2, 3, like in order almost, getting stronger. Yeah. Would that be fair?
Possibly, yes. I'm very fond of season 1.
It's very good.
But 3 and 4 are probably my favorites.
So I think mostly 3 and 4 then is kind of where we diverged. So so season 1 and 2 were mostly just you and I talking about everything we loved, and there was basically no disagreement. Season 3 we kind of differed on some things, but it was actually kind of interesting. I liked hearing the differences. Season 4, I would say overall I think I felt kind of similarly to season 4 as I did season 3, which is to say there are some parts I really liked, there are some parts I didn't, but season 3 was kind of a little rocky for me, mainly because coming off of season 2, it was a little harder for me because I was so into season 2 and I was less. Season 4 just kind of felt more like a continuation of season 3 for me in terms of like what I liked or didn't like about the show. So it was pretty easy going down. I didn't, I liked it well enough. But I definitely still had the feeling that this was not as good for me as like season 2, if that makes sense.
Okay. I'm very curious, like if down the line, years from now, you would kind of watch it again or something, and if you would still feel in exactly the same way. I'm thinking of my own reaction to a couple of things that the Matrix trilogy, for example. I watched the first. I loved the first one. I watched the second one. I loved the second one. Okay. A lot of people didn't. I loved the second one. Watched the third one. Couldn't get into it because I felt that it wasn't continuing from the second one in the way that I thought it would.
Okay.
Watching it again later with a different mindset, it's somehow I felt that it flowed perfectly. And now I like the third one very much. And I wonder if like the things that we focus on, I'm not saying that obviously that your opinion is incorrect.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering because I've noticed this in myself over the years. Lost is another thing where I've talked about it before, where I also kind of fell out with the show for a while. And then watching that again, I'm like, no, wait, that actually makes sense to me now because I understand what they were doing. And I don't know. I wonder sometimes if, the things that you really appreciated about season 2 in a way led you to expect more of those in the later seasons.
Yes.
The show was interested in something else.
Yes.
But the things that it is interested in are interesting and good. They're just different. And, that kind of mismatch. But I have no idea if that's accurate.
Well,
maybe you'll.
It's entirely possible. Yeah, I would say it's entirely possible. What I would say, though, is that also knowing what's going to happen can change how you watch something. I think I mentioned this to you. I don't think it was on stream. I think we were just talking separately. But I Heart Huckabees is one of my favorite movies. And the first time I watched it, I was just like, meh. I was like, it was fine, but I didn't really have it. But on repeat viewings, I happened to see it again. I was like, oh wow, that was really good. And so it's entirely possible that sometimes some things when you watch them the first time, maybe just because of they don't manage your expectations well, or they set things up in ways that don't work as well for you, but knowing how they're going to go and then you watch them again, your brain can focus on different things than it was focused on the first time, and it definitely changes. So I've had that same experience. I don't know if I'd have Babylon 5, but I had that same experience with other work for sure. Absolutely.
Yeah, and similarly in a way to Lost, P5 is a story that's told in the past tense very much. But the first time you're watching it, you're in the present tense. You're watching it. It's happening now to these characters. But it does a lot of ultimately turning that perspective around and giving you this feeling of these are events of the historical past.
Yes.
And that also really changes from once I've seen the entire thing, I kind of, it's less that I'm watching an adventure that's happening now, and it's more that I'm watching these historical events that happened. And that also, I think, affects kind of how you see it once you've seen the whole thing.
No, I totally agree. And like I think you originally said, well, I don't know that you originally said anything about it. You was kind of mentioning in passing, but you said something along the lines of like, it's not just World War II in space or something like that. You said something along those lines. It was kind of a throwaway comment in one of the previous ones. And in this one, you kind of do get the feeling that it's sort of World War II. They like form the UN at the end of this, for example. So you kind of feel, it does feel more like, oh yeah, we're going through all of these things in an imagined space history that, kind of try to give you some perspective in how the world evolved at that point, or whatever, however you want to look at that.
Yeah, exactly.
So, do you want to just get started? You want to just go through it here?
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. So, season 4 started out, for me, incredibly strong. So I absolutely love the beginning of season 4. I think we talked about this last time, where I love sort of play style, like theater style machinations. I absolutely love, and that the first part of this season is just packed full of that. Londo Mollari returns to find almost a Shakespearean emperor kind of a situation, right? Like it's exactly yes, it's exactly what I love. It was almost like a fan service for me, the degree to which this stuff was great. And they proceed to have a several episode arc that's absolutely just like it was some of the best stuff in the show. This is why I say like season 4, much more so than season 3, I think, had a high point that was pretty remarkable. Everything in this entire arc was fantastic. I guess I'll just say that.
Okay.
I loved so I'm not even sure where to start talking about what I liked about this, but I'll just try to point out all of the things that it has in it that make me just like totally engrossed. So first of all, and maybe I can contrast this with some of the stuff that I wasn't that interested as much in the back half of the season, and for the exact same reasons. Meaning the things that are in the first part of the season aren't in the back half of the season, and they literally are why I wasn't completely into season 4.
Okay.
So, first of all, I love the fact that we spend so much time with everybody. Like, I really like getting into like the characters, including the opposition. So the fact that we get to know this emperor is really important to me. Like, I like to see who it is that is on the opposite side. And I think that is kind of, I don't want to use Shakespearean because I'm not a huge Shakespeare fan or anything, but I'll say like it's a theater thing. Typically, the villain and the hero in theater have similar screen times, or in a sense. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And if you look at what happens in sort of the latter part of the season, crucial villains like President Clark almost never even speak, right? They're not, you don't really spend any time with them. It's more just about the heroes and what they're having to do, which is totally fine. It just isn't the way that I like to experience the things as much. I like that sort of
Yes,
immersive aspect of it. Does that make sense?
I completely agree. While at the same time, it's not a flaw to me
Mm-hmm.
because
Yeah.
Katagia is interesting, and I think the point of President Clark is that he is
But no,
banal.
okay. Yeah.
He is just something that the system kind of
Produced.
spat
Yeah.
out. He is a petty, stupid man. And yes, ideally, you would have seen more of him, I think. I do. Okay, I would not give him as much screen time as Katagia, but I would give
Yeah.
him more than he has. I don't think that was in the budget, probably.
Well, and the season
But
kind of
yes,
got squished according to what you're saying before too,
yes,
right?
yes,
So yeah.
it got squished by like 6 or 7 episodes that would have carried over into the next season. It would have normally ended on intersections in real time. That would have been that was the intended finale. But
Intersections in real time is that the
the
torture? No, well, the
yes,
brainwashing process.
yes,
Yeah.
yes. Um, but nevertheless, I don't have a problem, I think, with Clark being this distant figure because, I mean, what is the president to you as well? It's like this nobody who sits somewhere in a house, makes decisions or
Yeah.
pretends to make
Yeah.
decisions for you, and so it doesn't bother me, but I fully understand your reaction.
So, that start to the season, again, loved Katagia, and I loved it specifically because it also, I feel like it was crucial in sort of seeing Londo Mollari's kind of change, like, or his character kind of comes forward in this. The good aspects of his character come forward in this plot arc. In a way that they haven't really necessarily before. So, he in the past has talked about what he wants for his people, and it's sort of hard to know to what extent he's telling the truth. Like when he speaks to Morton asks him what he wants, and he's like, I want my people to be great again or whatever. It's unclear when he's saying that whether he means he just wants the good times back or whether he actually cares about people. Do you know what I'm saying? Like when it happens, then it's not clear. Does that? I don't know if that makes sense to you, what I'm saying, but
no, absolutely. I mean, you can say whatever you want as a politician, and then what is the truth of what you do?
Yes. And so in this part, I really like the fact that Katagia is almost the bad aspects of Londo Mollari's persona if they were distilled down into a person. It's just someone who is completely obsessed with all of the, like, physical trappings of power and having people who entertain him and everyone doing whatever he says. And it's sort of like almost a way, more so than the flash forwards that we've seen with Londo Mollari. It's almost like a way for us to see what happens when you only care about those things. This is the mentality that you would end up with. You're kind of mad. You're either driven mad or you just are mad because that's really no way to be as a person, if that makes sense.
Yeah, absolutely.
So I loved seeing Londo have to confront for the first time in the present, like in the actual tangible present. I loved seeing him have to confront the bad elements of his personality as a person, and he has to deal with them. And I feel like more so than anything else, I imagined this cementing his good qualities because he's faced with his bad qualities in a way.
Yeah, and it allows Londo to have some moments of genuine goodness and doing the right thing that we kind of hoped he had in him. And we have seen glimpses of the future. We know it's not necessarily going to end well.
Yes.
We don't know why it's going to end where it's going to end, but it nevertheless shows Londo at his best. Which is it is moving that he gets this opportunity to do that. And of course the same goes for Veer.
Yes. So Veer and G'Kar come into this now in a great way, which is, I think, another reason why I loved this whole arc. or I don't know, subplot. I don't know what you want to call it. Arc is a weird
Yeah,
term. I never really know exactly what it refers to, but this sort of subplot or subsection. So the other part of this that I think is so great is that the most memorable climaxes or dramatic moments to me come when we as the audience are invested in a character's decisions, but we don't know how they will make those decisions. And I feel like most of the time when I watch things nowadays, I am left either with climaxes or dramatic quote unquote situations where characters don't really have decisions to make. It's just going to happen whatever's going to happen, or the decisions are obvious, or they have a decision to make but it's so trite that I never believe that there's any variability. Does this make sense?
yes, it's the very frequently it's, oh, I have to save so and so and he will help us all, but I once misunderstood something that he said
Yeah.
10 episodes ago and now I'm pissed at him and I'll
Yes.
let the universe die
Yeah.
because I think that he said something about my girlfriend.
Yes.
And yes.
Yeah.
And it's also very frequently about, not even about choices, but about just like a character for very unbelievable reasons just not acting when they should act,
Yes.
or something like that. Or you have the button that ends all problems but you don't want to press it
Yep.
because your daddy, or something.
Yes. Yes.
And here it's about choices that have consequences. It's not an easy thing to do, but they are faced with a situation where they have to, pick a side and the consequences will be very real. And I think Via is also, I adore everything that happens with Via. Just the fact that he's gone from this pathetic little thing that he was to the man who kills the emperor.
Yes.
And also who decides that the emperor must be killed. I think that's one of my favorite moments.
Yes. I mean, I agree with absolutely all of this, and I would bring G'Kar into that as well. So if I had to say what I think is so remarkable about this series, it brings together three characters that are great, right? Like Veer, G'Kar, and Londo are three of the best characters in the show. I would say Londo is probably my favorite character in the show. But you're talking about three of the strongest, most interesting characters in the show to begin with. It brings them together, and each one of them has to confront something that is very difficult for them, and we know that it is. We know that Veer doesn't really have it in him to kill somebody. We know this is a huge ask for him. We know that Londo does not, it is not natural for him to help G'Kar or the Narns or go against his emperor. We know that G'Kar, that the pride that he feels in his traditions and his ways and what a Narn does not do is like paramount to him, and it's going to be an incredible struggle for him to pretend to be a subservient, submissive person. And yet this situation asks exactly those things of all three, and it feels natural, right? It feels like plausible. It's such a great setup. I just absolutely love it. And all three of them have to confront that, and they do in interesting and satisfying scenes.
Yeah. No, absolutely. And there are moments there that they remain in your memory. They're these moments that give you chills when G'Kar breaks the chains, or when Veer stabs the fucking emperor.
Yeah. Oh, well, when Londo Mollari drops the thing because he the emperor grabs him and he drops the little stabbing device. I don't know what you call that thing.
Yeah.
Which, by the way, again, I loved even that. Again, it all felt like a classic play to me. It felt like a thing where they go to the apothecary and get the poison that's going to kill the dude, or maybe not, right, or whatever. It felt, all of those things just felt so classic to me. I was just, the whole time, I was like on the edge of my, couch, I guess you would say.
Yeah, no, it's really great because in that moment, when he drops it, and you think only Mollari can do this, Veer cannot do this. and then you have this overcoming of that, and
Yeah.
you realize, oh shit, Veer has done it.
Yes. Yes.
That's a very powerful thing.
So, I guess
And
there's
also the kind of weirdly tragic way that the Emperor dies in his
yes.
delusions, and the sadness of that. It's
Yes.
such a good performance. It's very big, but I don't mind because it's supposed to be big. It is a mad Roman emperor
Oh,
essentially, and
absolutely.
it needs to be. It needs to chew the scenery in a good way, and I love it. I love that whole performance.
That whole thing was spectacular when Londo first walks into, I don't know what you call the Centauri Emperor's throne room, but when he walks into the
The
throne
throne
room
room.
and he says, his face just goes like ashen, and he's like, Emperor, you're wearing your hair much lower, like much smaller than is befitting of your stature. It's such a great beginning to this whole thing. Like everything from that moment on was just pure gold. And one thing we didn't mention, I wanted to just sneak in there because I loved it. I don't know if it's just my naivete, but I actually wasn't sure in the scene where G'Kar is whipped. I wasn't sure if he was going to scream. I really didn't know. Like, I mean, I kind of knew because I'm like, I think I know he's in the rest of the show, but like, if I didn't know that, I was legitimately not sure.
Yeah, because it's not some small thing, because
It's not.
it takes so much for that to happen.
Yes.
And season one G'Kar would not have.
Probably not. He probably would have just chosen death because that would have been. I mean, we know that this is a person who, like, was terrified of not having the fruit he needed for his religious ceremony once a year. Like, he thought that was going to be like the worst thing ever to not like how would he ever like get over that, right? And he's gone from that person to a person who's like, if this is what it takes to like improve the state of the world, then that's, I guess, just what I'm going to have to do. And I'm going to push it to the last moment so that I still know, like, in my head that I could have done it, but I'm not gonna, because I'll, possibly because he's had the experience of being in Londo's head, and he's had, he's had seen all these things, right? That has changed, who he is.
Yeah, but just the fact that, I mean, that's a remarkable thing about art, that it's actually all there. We've followed this character from that point to being this kind of wise individual, and it's just, you feel it and you believe it. So you can also kind of in your own life imagine that, yes, this is possible. It's possible to go from this messed up, angry person to reaching some kind of enlightenment.
Yes.
And that's a very powerful thing to experience.
Well, and people often use or used to, I don't even know if they bother anymore, they use the phrase dynamic characters to talk about characters who undergo some kind of a change. And I think I underappreciated that kind of, where that kind of comment was coming from. Like, well, who cares what, this, that, the other thing. I think having seen how far things have degraded writing quality-wise these days, I appreciate a lot more just the basic concept that, like, look, if we're going to watch something, maybe we should show some aspect of how humans, like show something that's either a cautionary tale or an enlightening tale or something that shows how people change. It makes it more worth it to what it feels like you've actually engaged with something to see that. Whereas, if you watch a show, if you watch Picard or whatever, you just see a bunch of people who nothing happened. Like you can't fundamentally find any sort of actual human processing, emotional processing that's happening on the screen, and you feel it just goes away. Like after it's over, it just leaves your head as a result. Whereas that whole sequence with the Emperor and Londo and Veer and G'Kar, I feel like I felt it, it's like it's there permanently almost.
Yeah, it does have that quality. And I think also showing stories of people also getting better is important to me, because it used to be kind of a prime kind of concept that we had. Like, I mean, like the whole Luke Skywalker and his father and saving Darth Vader and all of that, right? Versus essentially, if you look at the new Star Wars trilogy, what they wanted to do was, here's Darth Vader again, but this time he can't be redeemed.
Mm-hmm.
And then at the end, they kind of changed their minds because it was, well, because nobody likes that. And because, you know, the idea of redemption is a very powerful and meaningful one to us messed up human beings. And we see characters also fall. We see Londo's descent. But it's not just this kind of, you know, endless pornographic misery of everyone becoming more and more compromised, more and more evil. It's people also move in the opposite direction. There's definitely people who make mistakes, people who do become more compromised, but there's also the other thing, and that's so crucial to me in art, and it's just very frequently not there anymore.
I mean, absolutely. I guess I don't know. Maybe that's the last word on the Emperor sequence. I don't know if there was anything else. I don't want to harp on that too much. Did you have I guess I should ask you, did you have anything you wanted to talk about in that series that I didn't mention?
No, I think we mentioned most of the really important things. I mean, there's many very nicely drawn details,
yes.
But I really like all the performances. Basically everyone on Centauri Prime is fantastic. And Veer, I already said it, but I really have to underline how impressed I am by Veer's arc, because Londo's arc, you see that there's a very powerful dramatic performance there. G'Kar's arc, you also see a powerful performance from the beginning, and you think these could be very powerful characters.
Yes, right.
But Veer is like, you know, third spear holder from the left. Like he is a minor joke character. And how he goes from like the ridiculousness that he is in the beginning to what he is now is just so amazing to me. And that they would take the time with such a minor character to give him all this detail and then ultimately a kind of dignity
and a crucial role. I mean, if he hadn't killed the Emperor, none of this worked, right? Like he becomes almost a linchpin. Not only in that he's the one who makes the arrangements in the first place, but he's also the one who ends up having to pull the trigger, so to speak. He becomes a crucial character to this story in more ways than one.
And of course, this also ties into the bigger Shadow arc and Mr. Morden, and that's also one of my favorite payoffs ever, with Veer's little request coming true.
Yes,
that was very, very, very satisfying.
He kind of he sort of almost has a moment of like, is this what I want or not? And then he's like, yes, this is definitely what I wanted.
Yeah, exactly. He's like, whoa, is this bad?
No, it's fine. Yeah. And it was kind of his just desserts for the whole thing, which was great. Yeah. I mean, if anything, I guess I would almost say the only complaint I had in that entire sequence was that it was too short. Like I would have liked to have seen the end of it. And again, this is just me being selfish. Since I love this part so much, and I don't care as much about the sort of machinations that they go into more in the back half of the season, I would have liked 2 more episodes of like Centauri aftermath stuff, because I was so into it, and I was less into what came after it. The complaint I have about this section was I wasn't done. When they were done, I was like, I could have kept going. That's about it. I loved it so much.
Partially that is the compression there.
I'm sure.
Bit. Like if they just had 2 more episodes or something, I know that it wouldn't have been much longer, because I know that part of what Straczynski has basically talked about is that the point is that there wouldn't have been a point in stretching out the Shadow War forever, because you can't win the Shadow War.
Right, and it wasn't really the point.
Yeah. It's as someone says, you have to understand your way out of this. So there was no point in an endless military conflict because once it's escalated to the Vorlons and the Shadows, you can't win. It's over.
Right.
So it kind of was never going to take like half the season, but it would have taken a little bit longer. Yes. And I think that could have given us a little bit more space there to delve even more deeply into that. But nevertheless, I also enjoy that part very, very much.
So, before we get into sort of the back half, I wanted to take a quick break because I had gone back over my notes for the previous seasons and realized there were two things that I had written down that I never remember to talk to you about. So I want to take a break here and just talk to you about those, because one of them is a throwaway, and I'll just mention that quickly. And then the second one is one that I'm like, how did I forget to talk to you about this? So the first one is that I meant to mention, I've mentioned the humor multiple times. I have some notes about humor that was in this season as well. But I forgot to mention the Grey, like, they have 2 or 3 times where the Greys, I think they're called Greys normally, not in this show, but in the larger world.
I've forgotten their name right now.
Yeah,
Yes.
they're like the large head, large eye, small body aliens of like Close Encounters of the Third Kind or whatever, or like, you know what I'm talking about? I don't know what they're called in this.
Yeah, the typical abduction aliens.
Yes. They have such great like little throwaway jokes in here. The first time was like maybe season 1, I think. There's some courtroom stuff that happens for other reasons, and in passing, when they go back to the courtroom, it's like in the middle of a trial where someone is complaining about being abducted and basically having an anal probe. Like, they don't come right out and say it, but they basically say something like that. And then they cut to the defendant, and it's one of those Greys, and he holds up a little like symbol sign, and then they just cut away, right?
Yeah, I don't remember if he's saying that he was abducted or his like grandfather was abducted or something.
Yes.
I think it's something like that, but it's like, yes, the litigation concerning alien abduction.
Yes, it was so good.
Yeah, that was funny.
And they did it again where, like, I want to say, like, they show, like, doesn't Captain Sheridan get captured at one point and have, like, weird, like, probe things and all this stuff, and you just see walk by at one point another one of those Greys walks by outside, so you're like, oh, it's them again, right? Like, so basically, they keep making this joke as sort of like a thing that's in the background. I just wanted to mention
and the Minbari seem very irritated with them.
Yes.
Like, when Delenn talks about them, it's not like, oh, they're a great ancient enemy. It's more like, these people, what is wrong with them?
Yes, they keep coming and abducting people for no stupid reason, right? They're just like... Anyway, I liked that. I wanted to mention it. The second thing I actually wanted to hear your opinion of, because I'm like, okay, this, how did I forget to mention this episode or this part of the episode? Somebody who is a self-proclaimed classical Marxist, and I forget to mention the episode where a race of people comes to Babylon 5 who is greatly invested in a hierarchical system in their society where the best people, quote unquote, are like at the top, and they won't even speak to people who they consider to be classes below them. And Commander Ivanova is given the task of showing these people around the station in the hopes that they can come to an agreement to bring them in to the, sort of the alliance that they're trying to form among alien races and humanity. And she's showing them, she does what we would do, which is she shows them the parts of the station that are good. Like, here's our med lab, we help people here, and aliens come in and we heal them. And it has the exact opposite effect. The race is like, wait, you heal people without even knowing if they're like valuable members of society or as good as you. Just random aliens that come in that might just be garbage and we don't know, you heal them. And so she's having no luck with this until finally she begrudgingly shows them the crap part of the station, the part they call down below, which we've seen many times before, which is basically where like people who are homeless or some is drug addicts down on their luck, disenfranchised, out of the system, and they love it. They're like, you have figured out a way to keep your lower class out of the main part of the station. This is brilliant. Why didn't we think of this? Like, we never thought about in our own society getting rid of the riffraff this way. You guys are brilliant. So, and I was like, Jonas must have an opinion on this episode, and I forgot to bring it up even though it was in my notes. So there you go.
Yeah, I thought that was quite funny. And I mean, that exists in our world, obviously, as
Exactly.
well. There are people like that. There's the people who say, capitalism is good. It creates prosperity. It does this. It does that. Okay, fine. I'm with that. Those are my goals too.
Mm.
And then occasionally you meet someone who's like, no, it's good to punish the weak. It's good to have lots of poor people. It's good. And you're like, what? What are your goals for this world? But ideologies like that spring up on occasion, and of course, actually, these also kind of function as foreshadowing for the shadows, who
Yes.
have a similar kind of belief system, and I think that's in fact kind of their purpose a little bit as well, to kind of give you an idea that something like that might be out there.
Yes.
Yeah, no, that was funny. There are many small funny sequences all throughout that I love. I love the show's humor. I always have. I guess it's very similar to my own humor. I don't know. I'm trying to think of, but I think what we never discussed, it's not a joke sequence, but it's one of the best sequences. It's when Londo and G'Kar trapped in the elevator.
Oh,
and
yeah.
and they're about to die, and G'Kar thinks this is hilarious.
Yeah, yes.
He can kill Londo without even doing
Yeah.
anything. That's a wonderful scene. Apparently, a bit of trivia there. That scene was not written that way. It's one of the very few cases where something changed. So it was written with G'Kar finding this amusing, but it wasn't written in the way where G'Kar's laughing his ass off.
Okay.
And that was a choice that Andreas Katsulas made, and was like, can I do this, JMS? And he watched and was like, oh wow, this is really cool. Because it's not just, I'm glad that you're dying, Londo. It's just, this is incredibly funny to me. And I love that performance. I love how almost, I don't know how light G'Kar suddenly is. It's
yes.
like, Londo's like, oh, can anyone hear me?
Yeah.
I can hear you.
Yeah.
There's a lot of great moments like that. And I love how the show will put humor into next to tragedy, sometimes into tragedy, and that way things can just kind of, you go on this roller coaster ride of responses throughout the show, and I miss that in shows that are sometimes all grim all the time, or that are so heavy on the comedy and the lightness that I can't really get invested in the characters because they don't seem to have any real emotions.
Well, they also tend to. So I don't know that people write comedy much anymore. Like a lot of times, it's more like, well, we cast Eddie Murphy to play the donkey, and we just trust he'll say something funny or whatever, right? Like, and it's like they don't actually go like, wait a minute, we should write, like, the comedy should be written as well. Like, we shouldn't just have a comic relief character. Like, everyone has humor in them. I mean, most people do anyway. And thinking about how characters will or will not do something funny is different than we put in comic relief as like a specific thing that we do, right? And so there's, it feels a lot more natural in Babylon 5 because it's not like the one funny character, right?
Yeah. But like, even in a comedy show, like a show that I quite like, Scrubs, Scrubs at times it drifts too far into being too broad, but it will do like lots of comedy, and because it's a hospital show, every now and then it'll pull episodes that are like moments that are so bleak and so tragic, and it'll just crush you. Early on, almost kind of like to establish themselves, they do like an episode, I think it's not a huge spoiler for anyone, it's like one of the early episodes, which like, 1 in 3 patients dies, and then each of the main characters kind of has one patient, and you're wondering which patient is going to die. And at the end of the episode, they all die. and you're just like, whoa, this is a light comedy show. What the hell? And it just crushes you. It's brutal. And
a good lesson in probability.
Yes. But Babylon 5 does stuff like that too, where it can be quite funny and light. I mean, most of the show isn't, but it's not afraid to go into things being quite funny, and then it can also be incredibly tragic. And you have highs and you have lows instead of just this one tone that is constantly kept. I quite like shows that can kind of go off into weird places. and into weird tangents or different tones. Or I appreciate that very much about a show.
Well, it's somewhat hard to pull off too, because sometimes it just doesn't land. If you're not skilled at integrating multiple tones, it can feel really jarring. So it's nice to appreciate when a show manages to feel naturally fluid in that way, because life is naturally fluid in that way. You can have something tragic and something humorous, and they just kind of get shoved together, and it does kind of flow even if it's awkward. And so yeah, like it feels more natural if a show can have all of that and not and have it mix well.
Yeah. Anyway, let's go on.
Okay. So oh, and the last thing I'll mention is we should mention the Elvis impersonators on the comedy. In this season, there's just like one throwaway line where what's the fellow, Zach? I think his name is it Zach?
Yeah, Zach says it.
Okay,
yeah.
So Zach is head of security after Garibaldi resigns, and he's like talking about how crazy working at customs is, or whatever, immigration, whatever the position is where you take people's identity cards, and like he's like gives it to some underling. He's like, all right, I gotta go do this thing, and then like immediately like these Elvis impersonators like walk off the ramp,
and he makes some kind of comment about how like the next thing we'll get is like the second coming or something, and then three kings arrive, and yeah, it's glorious.
Anyway, putting that aside, so I guess I would say I'll sort of split this into two parts. And maybe, I don't know, you might disagree with how I characterize sort of the back half here, but
it's
sorry, go ahead.
It's Shadow War and then the Earth Civil War, basically, right? Like that's the
sort of. I would say that the subplot, though, that involves Garibaldi going to Mars was sort of something I took on its own terms, meaning that we can talk about that maybe second, because the Shadow War stuff maybe we'll talk about first. But that part to me was pretty important for other reasons that have nothing to do with Earth Civil War. But yeah. So let's start with the Shadow War part. I was fine with the Shadow War ending. Briefly, I don't know if that was something that people complained about when they complained about the pacing of season 4, if they wanted that to be the whole season, or if I don't really know. I know there are some complaints about season 4.
I think that's the main complaint, is that they wanted a bigger war there, but it's not really about the spaceships exploding.
And I guess I don't have a strong opinion about that part. I guess like if I love The Hunt for Red October. I love Wrath of Khan. If you want to end something with a really interesting series of military tactical things that make sense dramatically and I'm invested in it, I'm fine with that. So I would not have complained if that had been the way that this had gone, if I felt like those battles were satisfying. If it was Star Trek Discovery and it's just exploding ships everywhere and I have no idea what's going on and don't care, obviously bad. But I could believe that this show could have done something. So I don't know that I want to say offhand that I would have been upset with that. I will say that I don't care that it wasn't that. What I do care about, however, is I didn't feel like the way the Shadow War was resolved was particularly interesting to me. So, basically what happens in this is they create a conflict where they can draw the Shadow vessels and the Vorlon vessels into sort of the same place, the same place at the same time. And we don't really know why they're doing this because the audience hasn't been told. But the reason is because Delenn and Sheridan and Lorian.
Yeah, Lorian.
Lorian, who is sort of like God. He's not really God, but he's sort of like an old progenitor kind of. I don't know.
An incredibly ancient alien. Yeah. He is incredibly ancient. One of the first ones, I suppose. One of the very first sort of sentient.
The first
living
ones. Yeah.
Yes.
And he has sort of magical powers. He can do things. like bring people back from the dead temporarily. He's almost like a necromancer. He can raise Sheridan from the dead more than once. But he has some other, we don't really know exactly what his powers are, I suppose. But for whatever reason, Sheridan and Delenn have sort of created a plan, presumably largely with Lorien's help, because a lot of the information would not really have been available to Delenn and Sheridan without him, without his presumably off-screen explanations. And their plan is to simply try to directly convince the Shadow and Vorlon contingents to this battle that there isn't really a need for them, because in general they have become ineffective at actually providing the kind of evolutionary pressure that they believe they are providing. I mean, was that a relatively fair statement?
Yes, I mean, and the kind of guidance that they claim that they're giving. I mean,
yes,
it does go a little bit into the idea of what is the life cycle of these civilizations in the galaxy, which is that eventually when they grow very, very advanced, they go beyond the rim, and they let new generations, new civilizations, rise and find their own way, and they have failed to do so.
Yes. Well, and it feels almost a little bit, I don't know if Buddhist is the right word for it, but it feels almost like, our galaxy, our whatever you want to call the region that we live in, is like the training grounds, right? It's like being on Earth and being earthly or whatever, and then eventually as a race you ascend. Like going past the rim is like you've found spiritual enlightenment, and you are going, and it's not about spiritual enlightenment overtly or anything like that. I just mean it feels that kind of way to me. Like there's a proving grounds or a place where you are tethered to some more primitive way of existing, and eventually you can break free of that and leave. And in fact, this season is all about that. The end of the season, in fact, is sort of showing you how humanity eventually does. I mean, at least I interpreted it at the end of the season.
Yeah, very much. It's one day humanity will reach the same point.
Far from now, but
far from now. But thanks to actions performed now in part. The end of the season is that last episode is very important in contextualizing, I think, a lot of what the show is about. There's a lot to discuss there. But yes, eventually, when you grow that advanced, you have to kind of move on and not die or stop, essentially, but go somewhere else, do other things. And the main thing is you cannot stay in the galaxy and keep telling everyone what to do. And that's what the Shadows and the Vorlons have done, and not necessarily out of evil, I think, but they're kind of lost. I quite like the last scene where a representative sort of each side shows up on the ship with Lorien, and when they talk about what's going to happen, they talk about being afraid of being alone, and there's a very they're almost childlike in a way. They're so advanced that they've kind of gotten untethered from everything.
So let's talk about that then, because this was, I think, the main thing I didn't like. This encounter is what I didn't like, I guess I would say. I think it is highly plausible or possible that the idea of ending this conflict by realizing that the Vorlons and the Shadows are exactly what we just said that they were, and B, figuring out a way to convince them of that, I find that both plausible and good. So I am on board with the idea of how this gets resolved. What I was not on board with is the actual resolution. It basically happens entirely in a 5-minute segment. The audience has not got to participate in like any of that realization. It's very much just something that happens. So first you've heard of it, you have been intentionally kept out of the plan. And it's almost like the writing for this, they think the cool part is you finding out all these things in that moment and being like surprised by it or something. But to me, it just fell flat because what I wanted was I wanted to see all of the scenes about them realizing this and figuring out how, oh, how will we convince them like to do this, and more an elongated, like I wanted those episodes. Like I don't want this mysterious Lorian character and Delenn and Sheridan to have figured all this out behind the scenes, come up with this plan, and then spring it on me. It just fell really flat because all of the excitement is kind of gone for me at that point. Like all the interesting things just kind of were elided out of the story and not shown. And to me, that's why that part really fell flat. I was totally fine with it. Like when they said it, I wasn't like, oh, come on, that's stupid. Like I was like, no, all right, that's totally, I'm totally on board with that. But I didn't find the drama didn't come out of it. And to tie back to my earlier point, no character had to do something here that really felt like progress for that character. I didn't feel like anyone was really putting themselves on the line or changing how they did things or making a sacrifice or any of the kind of things that I associate with that drama. So all of that just kind of didn't work for me. Not because of the underlying premise, not because I disagree with it or find it implausible or any of that stuff. I just didn't like the tactical writing.
Yeah. Well, I mean, there is a sacrifice in the sense that, but it's not specifically in this moment. It is what Sheridan gives up in order to, when he goes to Zahadum, which ultimately leads to all of these things.
Yes.
And once you've seen the final episode of the show, maybe that will feel more powerful in retrospect. No spoilers or anything. It is set 20 years later when his life runs out. And
yes. That makes sense.
And this mortality, I think, and the preciousness of the time that we have is a very, very big theme in the show. And I do think that there is a way to that for me, in that Sheridan gives up a lot ultimately for making all of this happen. I think one of the things about how this plays out, and this also plays into the rest of the season, and I think that may bother you, but doesn't bother me. Well, again, as I keep saying, I see your point, but it doesn't bother me. Is Sheridan becomes a little bit more remote. Sheridan becomes a little bit more mysterious, and that we see how Garibaldi reacts to that. We see how other people react to that. Sheridan starts being mythologized.
Yes.
He starts becoming, half historical, half mythological, kind of as a figure. And we still see plenty of his, everyday life and his personality, but there is a distancing that starts happening. And I mean, certainly you even see characters, right? Garibaldi, especially, being like, who is this Lorian guy? Why is he here? Why is everything being done without consulting us? Like in season 3, we sat down at a table and talked about what do we do about President Clark and that they're coming for us and so on. Do we fight? Do we, surrender? And now Sheridan has some autocratic tendencies here.
Yes.
So to me, basically, it feels as part of that thing. While at the same time, I see what you mean. I see, and I do think that it happens a little bit rapidly, and that is kind of part of it. It's not that there aren't more battles; is that you do kind of wish for a little bit more time to explain and discuss everything that this means. This big end of the war. And I feel that I suspect personally that it just comes from the fact that at this point the season is just going full steam ahead. It has they've been told they're canceled. Do it as quickly as you can, and a couple of things fall by the wayside. And yes, I think ideally you would basically have like a 2-part episode there or something. I do want to come back to one thing, because you said sacrifice. There's something that I find very, very moving in all of this.
Yes, please.
Which is Bryan Cranston's appearance.
Yes, right.
Yes,
I forgot about that.
As the ranger who is sent to be the bait for all of this. And I feel that this is something that I've almost never seen in any medium. It's very rare to see this moment in which someone who is in charge of, a military operation, of a war or something, has to send someone on a suicide mission but it's not, oh, you're all crazy punks and we're going to send you to do this. And of course, half of you will survive. But it's like, no, this is, you're going to die. And the scenes in which Sheridan talks to him, the weight on Sheridan of having to say to someone, you're not going to go risk your life, you're going to go die. Those scenes I find immensely powerful. The way Sheridan asks him if he's married and is then relieved that he's not, and all of that. That I think has a lot of weight to me.
I liked the idea of that, but I didn't feel like it came across as well, again, because I think maybe I demand an unrealistic amount of investment. But like, because I'd never heard of this character before and had no idea who they were, while I could abstractly appreciate the sacrifice, it's not the same as if that had been a person we knew, right? That the show had spent time with and actually said, like, here's who they are. We've known them part of their lives. You didn't know they were going to be sacrificed. They weren't just introduced right before, And so to me, while I thought the writing of that scene was realistic, meaning it felt good in that they both said the kinds of things I imagine you would have to say in that and react the way they would have to react. I felt like emotionally it fell a little bit flat because of lack of development there. Does that make sense?
See, yeah, absolutely. And yet to me, I don't have that reaction at all, because to me, this is the walk-on part. Yeah. This is the spear carrier or whatever. This is a minor character. He's not one of the. You're not going to send necessarily one of your heroes. You're not going to send General so and so to do this. But the fact that just for once we register the tragedy of the minor soldier who gets sent on the impossible mission. I don't know. I found that. To me, it affects me very much. Like, I find the scene chilling, and I find that when you then hear him die, also very, very powerful. And it does a lot for me, I think, to feel that I feel there was a sacrifice. I feel there's a weight behind how they achieved the victory at Coriana 6. That kind of that does a lot of the work for me, And I don't need to be introduced to the character for that to work.
Well,
me.
If I could contrast it to, because like I said, I really liked season 1 and 2. This is not how they handled it in those seasons, right? So there's a very analogous season, a very analogous episode earlier, where they go like, you know what? The end of this episode is going to be a bunch of army soldiers just get absolutely massacred for an invasion that probably shouldn't have happened, right? And in that episode, like, we meet everybody. Like we get to know these people. We see them hang out at the bar. We get to see there's a female character who just wants like a romantic encounter with Garibaldi because she knows she's probably going to die. And she's just like, look, I have no illusions. Like, I'm not going to have a happy, like, married life in the future with a husband and raise children and have a, illustrious career or any of these things. There's like, no, like, I'm a ground soldier grunt. I'm going to get killed in this thing. And I'm trying to make the best of it. You got all of those things across. You really knew. And so when they die at the end, you knew what was actually going on viscerally.
I guess to me, the point is that at this point, where the momentum of the story is just different. Like, to me, it would feel wrong if we just waited around seeing this guy's life at this point in the story, right? And now, of course, ideally, you would have introduced this character 6-7 episodes before.
Right, yes.
So that you kind of in a very minor part and so on, which is incredibly hard to do on television.
Yeah.
It's very hard to book people and so on. And I think back then with how television was and how little money they had, it was even harder. But I completely get what you mean. And yet, I'm like, from the first time I've seen that, I was very, very moved by it.
Also, this show is about time loops. There's a number of things where we sort of say that there's like a freestanding structure in the fourth dimension that sort of exists and is part of the story. So if we assume that that's true, I think we also have to acknowledge it was probably very hard to get Bryan Cranston.
Okay.
I mean, he's very popular now, and he had
That's
to have known that if given the nature of time being fluid, you have to imagine that getting Bryan Cranston even before would have been very
uh-huh.
difficult.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
So,
Very, very tricky out there.
all right, bad
I was
time
trying to
humor
come up with a
aside.
bad joke in response, but
Sorry.
my brain kind of just went
Yeah,
and
sorry.
in about an hour I'll have a really good comeback.
Okay, so that was really my only complaint, though, because, like I said, I didn't share, I guess, what is the more common complaint, I guess, about it being rushed. I didn't really feel like it was rushed in that sense. Meaning, I didn't feel the need for there to be a lot more conflict. I really just wanted more character. I wanted it to be more fully fleshed out how that sort of stuff played out. What they actually chose to do, I was on board with.
Mm-hmm,
Um,
mm-hmm.
so, uh,
We should probably actually mention what it is about. I mean, it is this
go right
idea
ahead,
of
please.
humanity kind of having to find its own way,
Yes.
and all the younger species having to find their own way between chaos and order, so to speak, between the Soviet Union and the United States. It's like
Yeah.
we choose neither side. We don't want your endless neither Cold War nor hot war. We want to go some other way. That works for us. And yeah, that I think is then also kind of set up for then, okay, and now in the rest of the season we have to sort out our own shit.
You might
And
also
the
take it
Vorlons
as a bit of an
aren't going to help us.
anti-interventionist stance as well, right? Like you might also say that I mean, large. You mentioned U.S. and Russia. Large superpowers have a habit of going like, oh well, like really we should meddle in the development of these countries because we know how things should be, and obviously if they developed more along the lines that we think they should develop, they'll be better off, and we'll be better off, and the universe will be better off. And a lot of times the actual practical outcome, it's easy to imagine that it was simply worse than if you hadn't. And so I
Yeah.
feel like there's a bit of anti-interventionist sentiment there. At least I read it that way, where they're like, look, the Vorlons and the Shadows both think that they can make choices about how younger, less developed species or races or aliens or however you want to describe them will develop their natural structures, but in reality it may be that is just incorrect, that you can't really make those decisions because it's simply too complicated, and by trying to help them you're actually possibly hurting them.
Yeah, and at first they're fighting proxy wars, and
Yes.
everyone pays the price. And then when it becomes a direct war between the two species, between the Volans and the Shadows, it's just the end of days.
You
Which
pay a
is
higher
also
price. Yeah.
what's on this planet. Like,
Exactly. Yeah.
if there is a proper war between the superpowers, then it's just the end of days.
Yes, and anyone
We
who's
cannot afford that.
anyone who's in the unlucky places where those conflicts might occur, it's exactly. And I felt like that was pretty like the Vorlon just like destroying places that had shadow stuff in them because they didn't want to be bothered trying to suss out. That felt fairly plausible. There's like, look, I mean, some place like Yemen comes to mind where it's just like, look, this place is just now getting completely destroyed, largely because a superpower or two doesn't want to really care about the details. They're just like, there's problems here for us, so we're just gonna like destroy whole sections of it or cause them to be destroyed. Again, felt fairly plausible. Like blowing up a planet or whatever is obviously a bigger scale, but just if you imagine scaling up those sorts of conflicts to the size of the universe, it felt plausible to me, the kinds of things that happen when superpowers just decide they don't care, they just need something to be taken care of. That does sort of seem like what happens.
Yeah. That's very much what it is. It's not like a one-to-one metaphor exactly, but
Yeah.
it is very much that kind of historical
Feeling.
event when exactly, yes. A lot that's it's very interesting to talk about. I think we're going to talk about that a little bit more when we get to the end, but history. And this is a historical show, and there's something Tolkien wrote about in the introduction to the Lord of the Rings, where he says that what he likes is is applicability. That's what he's looking for. It's not
Nice. Yeah.
allegory, not metaphor.
Yes.
But it's that you can take this and think about it and apply it to the world, and it'll spark thoughts
Yes.
but it's not this is this and this is that in this kind of simplistic way. You can find lots of parallels in the show with various historic the American Civil War and
Yep.
World War II and all kinds of things, but it's not like this is where one thing has a one-to-one correspondence with another thing.
Yeah, it feeling authentic is really the important part. Like this feel like yeah, applicability is a great way to describe that. Like this is something that I could really that I can sort of think about that will make my brain better at thinking about things, right? Like it's not
Yeah.
fake. It doesn't lead to highly erroneous conclusions. It's not propaganda, right? It's just like, yeah, this is a thing that's plausible and you should think about it. You should consider it. You'd be better for it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So, I guess let me split like I said into two things here now for the back half of the season after the Shadow War is resolved. The main thing I want to talk about is the Garibaldi stuff because
Okay.
again that's very characters it's very character focused. It's the kind of thing that I'm interested in and I had some things I wanted to talk about there. And then the other part is sort of like the conclusion uh, of the sort of conflict with President Clark, the internal Earth struggle, which I was less into, and because again, it's a much higher level. It's a very sort of like there's a lot more sort of overarching political big events happening, which again, I guess I would say I just tend to not be that into. Have you ever seen or read the manga for Attack on Titan? Let's ask.
No, I haven't.
Okay, so Attack on Titan. I would actually say it's a very well-written thing. It's incredibly meticulous, much like Babylon 5. Things that happen in the very first episode of this massive, sprawling series are all tied in. Like, everything is just so the entire time. And I like most of it, but the part where it really falls apart to me is whenever they try to portray any kind of political things, it always kind of falls flat because politics is very diffuse and complicated, and I find it incredibly hard to boil down to the kinds of things that it always ends up getting boiled down to. I don't know if that makes any sense.
Yeah.
And so in general, I find that across most things, I have a really hard time relating to portrayals of politics because they always feel too too abridged, too simplified. Does this? And I'm sure how to explain that. Does that make sense?
No, okay. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah, makes sense.
So putting that part of this season aside, and we'll talk about that sort of afterwards. Just talking about the Garibaldi stuff because that I could really engage with a lot more. I would say that I felt really let down by the whole Psy-Corps implanted Garibaldi thing. The reason I felt let down by it is because I actually wanted the real version of this, where Garibaldi just actually really decides, with no insidious, like, behind-the-scenes machinations by Bester or anybody, that he doesn't trust Sheridan and is in fact going to take up a counter, a position counter to what Sheridan is doing. I liked that concept, and I felt like it really didn't have a satisfying conclusion because it was deflated a lot by this sort of like subverting of the whole situation by making it be like, well, it wasn't really Garibaldi's fault.
While at the same time, okay, I fully agree. It's not a huge problem for me, but I would have liked his disagreement to be more himself.
Exactly.
At the same time, it does say, and it does remain clear that what Bester did exacerbated the issue. It didn't create it. He wasn't like completely under Bester's control, and he does have a problem with Sheridan, and like he does disagree, and also. Even in season 5, it never quite goes back. There's always this kind of thing in their history. They do kind of patch things up, but it doesn't quite go back to where it was before. and because they did really disagree on some level.
Well, and I mean, I guess I would say, but my complaint is very practical, meaning I wanted the resolution. I wanted that to play out all the way. I didn't want there to be a point where Garibaldi realizes that the whole reason he did it. I mean, his realization is not that, oh, I had a big problem with Sheridan and I was just pushed a little far. He basically claims or perceives it to be that it was entirely Bester's doing, and in fact he's going to go take revenge on him, and so on and so forth. So like the problem is actually like literal, like it's in the actual story, because I wanted it to come to a head where Garibaldi and Sheridan actually had to have it out, and they subvert that entire, like it really robs that plot arc of being satisfying to me because I don't get to see the end, if that makes sense.
Yeah, but there's a just, I guess this continues into season 5 where it doesn't really ever resolve.
Yeah.
Like it's it kind of, they patch things up and yet they don't. I mean, they do, but they don't. Like there is always just like they're never quite as close as they were before. And there's something messy and real and interesting about that to me. While at the same time, I do wish that it had been articulated more, that the disagreement, had been articulated even more clearly between the two of them.
And some of it also like takes away some, when you're watching that plot play out, it also doesn't feel like Garibaldi is really making all of those decisions himself either. The way that it's played is, and that, like, the whole time it's robbing that plot arc of what I actually wanted. I wanted to see Garibaldi actually wrestle with the decision about whether to turn in Sheridan or not, but he doesn't really feel like he is, and we find out later that he probably wasn't, because he
is being manipulated. Yeah, he is definitely being manipulated. Yeah. Now, on the other hand, when we look at some of the inspirations of the show, the CIA, Vietnam, all these things, the idea of this kind of mind manipulation happening against political opponents is it makes sense. You know where it's coming from. Like, it's not something that's inappropriate to the show.
It's not implausible either, because they've spent plenty of time explaining that this is something that could happen. We've seen in the previous seasons, we've seen even cutaways to them sort of doing things like this.
Yeah, we've seen a lot of examples of things like this happening.
So it's totally plausible. I just don't find that sasatisfying. It was like, I don't really care about it, right?
I fully know what you mean. Yeah. I fully know what you mean. I like the episodes very much. I like very much like the performance. This kind of a quiet sadness kind of comes across Garibaldi here, which I find very interesting. And he knows that what he's doing is wrong, and it's very tragic, because he agrees and yet disagrees, and he knows something is off, and he can't quite place it. And so I do like many aspects of those episodes, but I keep saying the same thing, which is I fully see what you mean, and yet it doesn't bother me so much,
which is fair,
because I enjoy the other aspects of it.
Yeah.
But yes, I do. I do fully agree. This is okay. Something about season 5 I think plays into this, I feel, which is that there are elements missing from season 5. I've told you season 5 had huge problems with the network and all that.
Maybe now is a good time for you to tell me too. You said like they lost, or did they lose actors for season 5 or something? Or
yes, they did. They lost Ivanova, which is a huge problem.
Especially since they just went through the trouble of saving her.
Yes. Thankfully, the final episode was already shot because of changes that were made, so she does reappear at the very end. And she was in a traumatic place. She left. It kind of works, but it's, for them, it was a huge issue, and it happened at the last moment. Some contract bullshit. And the exact truth of it, who knows? But it was kind of a controversy back then. But it was a huge issue, and they had been told that they were canceled, so they had pushed everything forward. Yep. And then they basically managed to sell a spin-off show to another television channel, TNT, and then managed to kind of talk them into also doing season 5 of Babylon 5. But then they had so many problems with the spin-off show because they had certain ideas about what that should be, and they kept being told, okay, no, you can't do this, no, you can't do that. And then basically plot elements were kind of like shifted back and forth. And I think it created kind of a chaos. And one element that I think was going to be explored in season 5 and didn't was a bigger exploration of the idea that Sheridan and Delenn might become autocratic in the future. There was going to be another time travel plot where someone comes from the future and says, you know, you're going to turn out to be bad guys. And I think some of the Garibaldi stuff could very well have latched into that and doesn't ultimately. And I think there would have been more exploration of Garibaldi's disagreements with Sheridan further down the line still. Now, there still is in season 5. It's still there. But it's not maybe as detailed as we would have liked in an ideal scenario.
Well, and that's why I keep saying the word tactical writing, is just because, like, in general, all of the ideas that they are sort of saying they want to put in there, I am on board with. Like, I want to see all these things. I, in fact, 100% agree that Sheridan was becoming too autocratic. He has his own propaganda network. He has a secret police force, effectively, with the Rangers. Like, it is bad. Like, I interpret him as not a very trustworthy figure in season 4 myself, which is, I think, part of why I wanted that arc to be a lot more direct and specific, because I didn't think it really needed that Psy-Corps sheen over it, and I thought the issues that it would have addressed if it hadn't done that would have been more interesting. And so, yeah, I mean, I guess what I would say is it was a tactical letdown for me, not a strategic letdown, because I actually wanted all of the ideas that were in there to be in there. I just didn't. I feel like I necessarily quite got them. I guess what I would say is, I was slightly surprised that the fact that the Mars transport tubes are explosion proof, that they went out of their way to show us in the past, was not used again. I kept thinking, like, oh, someone's probably exploding here, but it never did. Am I wrong about this weird bait and switch?
I don't know if it's a bait and switch.
Okay.
It's just something they showed.
Yeah,
you know?
yeah. I was like, they must have showed that for a reason. They went out of their way and then, like, never did. Like, no, that was just something to show. So I was like, all right, okay.
But you see, I really like that episode. I really like all these. There's a sense of, okay, in season 4, there's this sense of expansiveness. Like, characters travel places and have missions and adventures, and things are happening in all kinds of places. I really like that. I like Franklin and Marcus going off on on an adventure together and being kind of cranky at each other, and the whole relationship that builds between those two characters. Those two actors have a lot of chemistry, and I really like the humor there, but also the sort of more human moments. I those are the things I really appreciate. Franklin gets laid again. Marcus still doesn't.
Yes. Yep.
There's a nice little detail, I suppose, which is that they go as a married couple. They go as a homosexual couple, which, again, this is the 90s, when every single politician who now says they're in favor of gay rights was like, no, we cannot have this.
That's the job of the politician, is to say whatever seems like the thing to say at the time.
Yeah.
Always such people of integrity.
And the joke isn't about, oh no, it's men being married. No, what's funny is those two being married.
Yep. And in fact, Marcus takes to it immediately and is interested in the role playing, whereas, of course, Franklin wants nothing to do with it. So,
yeah, it's very sweet and it's very funny, and I really appreciate how those relationships kind of evolve and deepen between the other characters. Like, I don't know, I really like that duo. They have great chemistry, and I also like the characters on Mars. I like. Well, shall we talk about like the other stuff?
Sure.
Garibaldi goes to Mars and falls in with William Edgars, and there's kind of a revolutionary nationalist sort of movement on Mars at the same time. And I find a lot of these things very interesting. Edgar's is very interesting because he's kind of tragic. He's kind of aware that he's the bad guy on some level almost. He thinks this has to be done. And yet there's these moments where you're like, I think at some point he actually accidentally says that he's, working on a final solution or something like that for the telepath problem. And then he catches himself and realizes what he's just said. And that's very interesting because he's a bad guy. He is like most definitely a bad guy. Like his role in the universe is a very negative one. William Edgars has made the world a considerably worse place.
Yes.
But he seems like as a person to be really decent. He probably means quite well. And that also, I think some of the things that he says are very significant in the overall sort of historical dimension of the show. We also hear, for example, that Sheridan is disliked on Mars because he helped put down the food riots.
Right. Yes.
And again, you get the feeling, okay, this isn't just the good guy hero of the show. This is a historical figure, and he did things working for the government that are legal, but, questionable. And ultimately he did, start working against that government because he clearly wasn't comfortable with that. But still, it is more like watching the biography of, a Civil War general or something, where you can say, oh, he did these amazing things and these amazing things, and he also did some really bad things over there. Rather than just, this is hero man who does heroic things all the time. Yep. Or this is the hero man who then inexplicably kills puppies in episode 7. It's just, this is a figure. He is of his time. And something, maybe we need to talk about that more in the context of the last episode. But Sheridan is a figure with a particular sort of set of politics, which is almost apolitical, right? He is kind of a constitutionalist or something. Like he is someone who wants to defend the democratic status quo, but not necessarily radically change a lot of things. It's what I find very interesting, and I think maybe we'll talk more about that later, is just that you can look at all of this as history and you can criticize Sheridan historically rather than just personally. You can say he was a good man, he did what he could in this context, but you can also analyze where he may have gone wrong in some of the choices that he made. And the show is fairly explicit about that. For example, saying, he doesn't want to get rid of the position of the president. He just wants to get rid of the person who is the president. He doesn't want to change the political system. He wants to restore it. But he does also free Mars, which is, of course, a big choice. It is a big political choice. Okay, so anyway, those are just some random thoughts, which we'll maybe come back to at the end. And
well, in the very end too, there actually is literally a 5-minute segment, 10-minute segment, I don't know how long it was exactly, where they literally do criticize Sheridan historically. Like there's literally a set of historians talking about
yes,
and
although
it's more talking about the historians and how they have absolutely no idea what the heck happened, but the show kind of overtly talks about it as a history at that point.
Yeah. I want to talk about that final episode when we get through the rest of the stuff, sure. I think, because that's very interesting. Anyway, I do find Garibaldi's kind of journey on Mars personally very compelling, despite the issues that you mentioned.
Yeah.
The world that he kind of gets drawn into, and his reconnection with his former girlfriend, and
yes,
all of these things I found very interesting. And there is, like I said, there's a sadness to Garibaldi that comes out here that we always knew kind of was there. He had problems, he had drinking problems and so on, but here kind of manifests kind of a quiet sadness that I find very, very compelling.
I agree. And again, one of the reasons that I was critical of this sequence is because I liked it, meaning I saw a lot more potential here, and I felt like the Psychor thing undercut that potential, which is another way of me saying that I wanted more from it. Like I was really enjoying it. And I feel like, again, part of this is just a question of what the show wants to focus on is not necessarily what I wanted to focus on. Like what I found interesting was not necessarily what the show always found interesting. And you know, it's very clear that the show cared about showing things like forming the new UN, or you know how that starts. I don't care at all, right? Because I just felt like that sort of stuff is too large. Like I don't know how you really make that interesting, because it's such a diffuse political thing. And so I just wanted, you know, like if this entire season had just been Garibaldi on Mars and Londo on Centauri, that would have been the ultimate season for me, right? I love when they just get into the characters and talk about that. And I could tell that a lot of this season was about the writers focusing on things that they thought were important and interesting, and me not really thinking those things. Does that make sense?
Yes, because the show has this kind of zooming out quality. It
Yes.
starts with very, very, you know, close on the characters on Babylon 5.
Yeah.
And then they become involved in bigger and bigger and bigger events.
Yes.
But that's kind of also the thing. It's like, okay, here's the life of, you know, Abraham Lincoln before he became president. And then here's, you know, the Civil War and so on. So it's this thing of getting to know who these people were before things, you know, went, but it's also giving us an insight into who these people were, who essentially changed history with the choices that they made.
Yeah.
But yeah, if you're more interested in staying on the personal level, then as the show zooms out, you just get less of that.
And I think, well, and part of it is the zoom outs, they feel unsatisfying to me. And I think the reasons, because I have, like, for example, just to take in this season, where we're pretty far zoomed out, the way the UN is formed, the first we hear of it is Delenn has already written the whole charter. And it's just like, I mean, that's very unsatisfying. I'm like, so it's kind of like saying, like, okay, our history of the UN is Winston Churchill wrote something down on a piece of paper one day and showed up to, you know, Roosevelt and handed it to him or something. And it's just like, what, it just doesn't feel very interesting, because what's the story? It just happened, right? And so I found
you
like
seeing the process. That's the thing. You like seeing the step by step of how things come together. And the more the show accelerates, the less it can take time to do this. The more things happen off screen or in shortcuts, compared to season 1, where it was much more procedural about how things happen.
Well, and another way to say that is I like watching the how. I don't really care about the what. I might say that as a viewer, I am incredibly flexible to the writers as to what they want to show me. You can show me the most horrible people in the world, or the best people in the world, or the weirdest stories in the world, or things that would be very uncomfortable to other audiences, and I have no problem. I will take your world for what it is, and I will not pass a judgment on that world's ethics or morals or opinions or anything. I will come play in your playground for the duration of your show. I have no problem with that. But the cost is I'm the opposite on the how. I demand you actually take it seriously and show me a plausible how for the things that you're doing, because I don't care about the what. It's not cool or not cool to me that you formed the UN in space. I don't care which one of those you choose to do. I don't care at all. What I want to know is the how interesting? Like, is what you're going to show me interesting? And so I feel like that was where a lot of these steps weren't interesting to me, because I'm just like, I just don't care if you form the UN in space. What I care about is the how interesting, and it wasn't in this season.
Okay, yeah. Whereas to me, this is interesting because it is about, you know, well, seeing the lives of people who make these big political choices in a, you know, sometimes revolutionary context, and sometimes not, and kind of living inside of history. But I get it, because season 1 and 2 are all like, okay, we need to do this. We'll have a council meeting. We'll disagree. We'll do something else. Then there'll be another council meeting. And I think what the show is trying to say is, okay, you know, we've kind of shown that this is a universe where these things happen. And then as we accelerate and zoom out, sometimes these things will be essentially elided, abbreviated. Because we don't need to go through it. And I do think you could do a show it would maybe be longer than Babylon 5 currently is. It would need more
Yeah.
episodes, but I think you could do that where it sticks to this hard political stuff. And that might be very, very cool. That might be an amazing show.
Well, yeah, and maybe another thing would be if you were to make a Babylon 5 with the proper support, because as we've discussed many times, a lot of these things are just like, yeah, I mean, they didn't have a lot to work with in this show. They didn't have, Netflix writing $7 million checks per episode or whatever else is happening nowadays.
No, they were under 1 million per episode.
Exactly, yeah.
And they couldn't even like at times afford actors, right?
Yeah.
Like they had to be incredibly careful about even the recurring parts like Veer and so on.
And Bester, I would assume, who I have to imagine they had to be very judicious. I would have liked to see him more in the series as well, but I'm sure that they got exactly that number of episodes, probably.
Yes, I mean, the actor Walter Koenig was once asked, like, what was your favorite episode of the Star Trek convention? And he mentioned an episode of Babylon 5, and everyone was like, no, he loved doing the show, but I mean, they just didn't have the money.
Yeah,
they just didn't have the money for anything.
Yeah.
I know that once or twice they had like someone on and they were like, we could bring that person back. And that person was like, sorry, the money's just not enough.
Yeah.
And of course that is an issue for actors. They need to live too.
Absolutely.
So I do think sometimes the show is doing everything that it can within the limitations that it's working within. But since we're talking about this whole, so we're talking about the Earth Civil War.
Yes.
So Sheridan starts a war against Earth, and the things start really to kind of heat up. And there are some things I find very interesting in there. One of the things I find most, I don't know. Anyway, they affect me when I watch them. There's moments where Sheridan talks about killing people who are of his own, people of his own side, of his own. And
more
there's
than once, really. That's come up a couple times.
And there's a clear argument that he makes at one point where he's like, if they surrender, we will allow them to surrender. If they have fired on civilian targets and they fire back at us, we will kill them.
Yeah.
And this use of violence there, I find, well, it's moving, it's sad, it's ugly, but it's also this kind of point where it becomes necessary to say there are certain, crimes against democracy where we won't just be like, oh no, it's so sad. Because the thing that happens in a lot of American movies, right, is that like you can kill 20,000 minor bad guys, but you can't kill the people in charge or the people who are responsible for anything.
Yes.
And at the end of every like American movie where 20,000 Chinese people have been shot, the good guy goes like, no, I will not shoot the bad guy. Violence is wrong.
Yep.
Which is, ridiculous. And I like that the show makes a serious argument about the uses of political violence, and that Sheridan makes an ethical argument that in this particular case, violence is justified, that he will give them a chance to stand down, but he will not fuck around with people who have bombed civilians. And I found that very, very powerful and just very unusual also to see that so clearly said.
Well, and I think part of that is the welcome aspect of the series, which is that they don't try to present good guys as unalloyed good guys. Like, one of the things they're probably trying to do in the things that you were talking about before, as negative examples, is they're trying to really cement the fact that this is a heroic person, and the way they're heroic is that they never kill anybody unnecessarily or whatever, right? And when you kind of have that sort of a caricature, it's not very interesting. Babylon 5 manages to be more interesting in a lot of ways, and one of those ways is by saying, like, good guys are actually also just regular people. And they are not going to always do just good things, which allows us to make real arguments or talk about real bargains they have to make with ethics and morals that feel more plausible,
Yeah, and this is two separate things in a way. One is the idea of the use of political violence, which in this case, I think is justified. It's correct.
Yeah.
It's like, yeah, sometimes, and especially in this kind of quasi-revolutionary situation, the use of political violence, not by one or two terrorists, but by, an armed force trying to accomplish something, can be justified. And here it is justified. And I think there's this sort of pseudo anti-violence thing in a lot of American media, where it's the kind of thing where if you think of Martin Luther King being saying when I say that we black people should be nonviolent, everybody claps, and when I say we shouldn't bomb children in Vietnam, everybody says I'm a communist.
Right, yeah.
So there is a tendency to depict certain forms of violence as acceptable, and then others, which would be, say, in some way revolutionary, anti-systemic or whatever, are suddenly always terrible without any differentiation. Because you wouldn't want to get ideas about getting rid of certain people who are ruining everybody's lives.
Right.
And I think the show is very kind of unique in being different about that. But at the same time, you're right. For example, Sheridan's use of the telepaths, the frozen telepaths, is very questionable.
Yeah.
And Franklin, for example, is very uncomfortable with it, doesn't know what else to do in that moment because it seems like a good tactical move, but is clearly deeply unethical.
It's kind of like conscription of people who do not even get the benefit of knowing they've been conscribed. Like you are essentially like demanding that people submit for military service who themselves cannot even be aware that they are participating, which is I think if it ever happened in the real world would be considered extremely unethical. I'm not sure what the equivalent would really be because it's hard to construct that situation. I mean, you know what? No, I suppose it's not that dissimilar from situations where very young children are involved in military conflict, which does happen occasionally. People who couldn't possibly really know what was going on being forced to serve in the military is basically what Sheridan 100% not only suggests and then does.
Yeah, and there you see his cleverness, but also his ruthlessness, and I mean, but it's necessary because political moments of this nature require people who are capable of things. And I don't mean necessarily this kind of, we're going to do the pragmatic thing and just like be awful, which happens like in Battlestar Galactica all the time. But there are moments when you're fighting battles that very, very difficult things will have to be done. And that is historically true. These things are inevitably ugly. And I do think this is a very good and complex depiction because it leaves you uncomfortable. And you can't just say that Sheridan was wrong. But you also can't say that he was right.
It's also unlike the first thing you brought up, which is that if we're fired upon by people who have bombed civilians, we're just going to blow up their ship and call it a day. That's a more, or I should say, it's a less morally ambiguous thing. It's a thing that you can kind of say like, all right, the deck is pretty stacked in favor of supporting that kind of decision. If you're at all pragmatic, it'd be a hard thing to argue with. Whereas, one of the reasons I liked using the telepaths for that purpose was because I feel like it's a much more morally ambiguous thing to do, because I would almost say it's probably something you should stand trial for. It's very different because these are non-military people. So in other words, you have literally like conscripted civilians and forced them to do something against their will, which is very different than firing on overtly military people. It definitely crosses a different moral line. And again, if I had any complaints about it, my complaint is that there's really just not a lot of dealing with the aftermath of it. I liked how much Franklin didn't like doing it at the time, thought that was very good, and then it happens and it's just kind of over. And there really aren't a lot of consequences or moral examinations that happen after the fact. And I didn't like that. Maybe they're coming in season 5, but I would have liked to have
No, I
seen a
don't think
lot
so.
more. I would have liked to have seen them taking that as a serious war crime, not maybe by Earth, because they kind of deal with the war crimes aspect on Earth as with a bit of a plea bargain kind of a thing that occurs. But I wanted to see, maybe him facing real consequences for that decision. I think would have been stronger in my opinion.
Yeah, although how often do people face the consequences?
Well,
Whether it's
yeah, you're
a
not wrong. Yeah, you're
um,
not wrong about that. But for example, they had a good avenue for doing it with Bester there, and they kind of elide that because he, is somebody who could have taken real offense to that and could have, created a way to examine it. Again, I don't need to see him face the consequences because I think he should face consequences. I'm saying there's a lot of interest there. I would have liked to have
yes,
seen
yes,
him have to defend himself to somebody, verbally at least, because that's interesting to me.
yeah, but I like it in the sense that it does really add an interesting color to Sheridan's character.
Yeah.
That we increasingly see other sides of him,
Yes.
also very likable and good sides, I think,
Yes.
but also a very hard side, especially after his death at Zahadum. He comes back and he is changed. He is harder. Um, but we do increasingly, like we talked about this, we do increasingly see his kind of scheming nature, his cleverness, and also his tendency towards building alliances and trying to think on this grander scale. Which is, I mean, the point of Sheridan in many ways, I think, is that he was a very unusual man who seemed very normal, and thus slipped into this position where everyone thought, oh, well, he's just this, this soldier dude doesn't really care about much. And there was a lot more to him. And that kind of affected political events, this kind of, him ending up in that nexus. Okay, so we continue. They go towards Earth. They eventually, first there's the betrayal by Garibaldi, which leads to intersections in real time. And I was wondering how you would react to that, because we've talked about episodes of this kind and whether sometimes you don't like them. I personally like this episode very, very much.
Do you mean because when I was
The
talking
torture?
okay.
Yeah. Because there is a parallel there to the equivalent to Star Trek, which has a kind of episode of this nature, which is, however, I find, while I do like that episode, it is much more simplistic. And first of all, I like the discussions in Intersections in Real Time very much. It is kind of, and so is the last episode, more openly about postmodernism and a postmodern view of the world, which has become, unfortunately, even more relevant now.
Right.
When that's kind of become the dominant way of looking at everything, looking at history, looking at historical figures, and how he kind of, against all these not really serious arguments, but serious seeming arguments that the interrogator brings, because they are, yeah, they're not. The interrogator isn't arguing for something genuine. He shifts his position all the time to whatever is convenient to break his subject in that moment. And yet, the way Sheridan argues against it and refuses to be broken, and the way that the show kind of stays with this and stays on these characters and the methods of kindness and then cruelty and all of these things, I find very, very compelling, as I find Sheridan's absolute unwillingness to break. And what I particularly like is the very, very bleak ending, which is, yes, you won, you refused to give in, you're stuck to your principles, which is what we all believe we would, do. And then it just keeps on going. And I feel that is it's a very great kind of reflection of what the world is like now in a lot of ways as well. Like, if you try to stick to your beliefs, that's great. You did it. Now do it again and again and again and again. And nobody actually gives a crap about what you're arguing or whether your arguments are logical or anything. And they'll twist their own positions into a pretzel at the drop of a hat, just to, just so this whole thing can kind of keep going. And so yeah, I found it very powerful and very sad at the same time as an episode. But you may have had a very different response.
So I would say that my I enjoyed uh, your metaphor there, description of that episode more than I enjoyed the actual episode. I would say I didn't dislike this episode. Uh, I just wasn't that invested in it. It's a little hard for me to piece apart, but I guess what I would say is I didn't because I didn't feel because I didn't really understand very much what I cared about or wanted out of it. It was hard for me to really engage with it. Let me try to draw some parallels between it and The Inquisitor, which, as I said, I absolutely loved. So I felt like I understood what the characters fundamentally wanted out of that episode. I understand what Jack the Ripper wanted and why. Because part of it was for himself and part of it was because it was his job. But they were different things, both of them. And I understood what Delenn wanted and what her confusion was about it. I understood what the Vorlons wanted. I understood what Sheridan wanted. I felt like I had a much better grasp on everything. And each exchange between the people was a new thing. I didn't know where it was going, and neither did they, right? It felt, it really, I don't know, I really got into that episode for that reason. This episode was less engrossing to me because I didn't really see there being plausible outcomes from it. I was just like, all right, I mean, either he's going to sign this thing or he isn't, but I'm not really discovering anything. I'm not really thinking that anything interesting is going to come out of this exchange, and it didn't. It was just kind of them repeating the same thing over and over again, and while that did perhaps while it was perhaps interesting to see the writing was kind of decent about how those exchanges might take place, they didn't really feel all that engaging to me because it just kind of felt more like it felt more typical to me what kind of happened. I don't know. So I never really got that interested in it. I was just like, well, he's probably going to get rescued from this at some point. And
Yeah, okay, but
I
you
don't
see,
know.
that's not really what matters. It doesn't really matter
Yeah.
whether he gets rescued or what the impact on the
Yeah.
plot is. It's about the idea of fighting for a better world and believing that your actions can have some sort of meaning in a time when, of course, we were told it was the end of history and nothing would ever change again, and nothing you could really do. You had on the one hand, Thatcher's "There is no alternative," and on the other side, you had postmodernism's what is it? Judgment, questioning, incredulity towards all meta narratives. So, which are basically exactly the same thing, but it's this idea that you can't understand the world, you can't even grasp reality, and you certainly can't do anything about it. Is this absolute negation, both of the possibilities of politics, but also of the individual in the historical political world. That was, very big then, and it has kind of metastasized now into another form, but is very much still present. So to me, it's very compelling because it is really about something philosophically and politically that has dominated the last 30 years. And yeah, so maybe because I am personally interested in or personally invested in it in that way, it's that the way that it keeps shifting and the interrogator keeps using yet another completely false, completely unreasonable approach to the subject matter, and just how that chips away at Sheridan, and yet nevertheless he refuses to give in, and ending with this thing that he wins every time he says no. He just refuses on this refusal to buy into this on some level and to break is, to me, very, very meaningful. And it says very, very much about Sheridan to me, who he is and what he believes. And it also ties to me very much to the last episode and the notion of history and people acting politically within history. But
okay, so I think the reason I'm having trouble getting there is because I feel like I don't feel like the actual story at this point, though, necessarily makes that true. The reason I say that is because, and again, just to try and make more explicit how my brain reacted to this versus how it reacted to the Inquisitor or something. Where Delenn ended up mentally at the end of the Inquisitor in practice mattered tremendously, whereas to me, like, I just didn't understand why it would matter what Sheridan said to this guy. Like in other words,
it doesn't.
That's,
it doesn't.
yes, and so
the only thing that matters is that he refuses to break. That's why the last thing that he says.
But why does that matter?
Well, because how else do you fight? How else do you go on in the world if you break?
Well, you just lie. I mean, you could just lie.
No. It's not whether he signs it or not. It's whether he mentally breaks. It's whether he buys into the whole thing or not. Whether you can withstand the constant assault on everything that you believe as a person that the world throws at you. I mean, the world is the interrogator. It goes on, and can you on some level keep saying no and keep sticking to what you believe when it's the world is designed essentially to break you? I think that's what it's about to me. So
interesting.
And the fact that it doesn't matter is part of the whole point, because that's how it ends. He says no, and then it just loops back to the beginning, and all of it is designed to break him. Even when he engages and tries to save the other guy or to talk to the other guy, tell him don't. It's all fake,
right?
Because everyone's playing their part, and I think that's really kind of what it's like if you want to stick to, let's say, those classic old democratic values that certain people care about, and I think that's kind of the experience of being in the world, and you won't always have the big political victories, or you won't always, you certainly won't convince the people in power that things should be different. But there is this question of can you stick to it? Can you not break internally? Can you still say no at the end of the day? So to me, that's what it's about, and that's why I find it powerful. And I do think it's very different from the Inquisitor episode.
Yes,
because that really is about them finding where they want to stand. And it's very beautiful and moving, the idea that you've stood, you've won, now you're ready for the big task. And this is the other side of the coin, which is if you decide to take on a battle, a war, for the betterment of the world, it's not just going to be this one big heroic moment, but it's going to be this grind. It's going to be this this constant fight against bad faith arguments and all of this, trying to grind you down, and that this is very bleak and very hard, and it breaks people, and somehow you have to find it in yourself to just keep saying no. So
I guess then, yeah, if I could put a final button on there where we, I think, split on this, because I like your interpretation of it, I just don't feel like it really sets that up very well. And I guess where I would place that is, look, this is a science fiction show. I mean, this is a science fiction show that has tons of different trappings. I mean, it's got a time loop. It's got people who can exist inside other people. It's got, like, people who can telekinetically, like, or put them telepathic and put themselves in your head, and vice versa, and all these sorts of things. If you wanted to create a situation where it was important that Sheridan not only not break, but not lie about breaking in order to just get out and start doing some other political maneuvering or who knows what else, this was not a very good construct for that. Because, again, I didn't even understand why it would matter what Sheridan said to this guy. Why couldn't he just lie? Why couldn't he be duplicitous? I didn't know why any of that would matter, because nobody believes sham of a thing anyway. Like the whole point of the whole rest of the season up to that point was that people are basically only going along with this nonsense out of fear anyway, and it's unclear. It seems like they will produce a signed document from Sheridan whether he signs it or not. Like, it just, none of it really set up that situation, whereas if in a sci-fi show, surely we could have had some reason why it would have actually mattered. It just doesn't make sense to me, James.
Yes, but to me, that's exactly it. Like, that's exactly the point.
Okay.
That's why they say, we can just fake this.
Okay.
We want you to break, but we can just fake this, and we will just fake this if you don't do what we say. And it's this feeling of pointlessness of struggling for a better world, I think, and that is manifested in the Interrogation. To me, that's
yeah.
And that's also, I mean, that's also where a lot of the kind of, shall we say, references kind of point towards these postmodern ideology.
Well, that was definitely explicit in, you know, he specifically says, like, you know, the truth is like changes all the time. Like, you know, let me give you some examples of the truth changing. And of course, the examples he give aren't actually examples of the truth changing, which I think is also the point.
Yes, exactly. But this is the ideology that ultimately convinces you that you cannot act upon the world.
Right. Okay.
Okay. So they continue. We continue from there, and ultimately they free Earth. Of course, there's a couple of big events there in the process of that, which is Marcus and Ivanova.
Yes. So what I would say about that is a couple like sort of high level comments. My first one is that I did not like it. It was one thing that was interesting about Ivanova. It was like a plus and minus. I did not care at all for Ivanova's farewell speech. So she goes into battle and she gives kind of a brief, like, I'm going to kill everyone speech. Mm-hmm. And it didn't really work for me. I don't know if it was the writing or if it was her delivery or something. I was like, that wasn't very good. I just didn't like it. But it was basically followed up by what I thought was one of her best performances, which is when she and Franklin basically debrief about the fact that Marcus has saved her life. This is a hard scene to play, and I thought it was both written extremely well, and I thought that both her especially, but also Franklin, were played beautifully in that scene. So as much as I didn't like her farewell speech, I absolutely loved that scene from start to finish pretty much.
Yeah, I actually agree. I mean, I feel ridiculous criticizing someone who wrote like 900 episodes of television here. But at the same time, if I were to nitpick it, the big epic speech that people quote a lot, I think it's like roughly 12 words too long. Okay, and I think it would have been perfectly fine. And then it just repeats itself just a little bit and goes just a little bit over the top. And then it doesn't work as well as it should. But I also agree that the last scene basically there with the two of them is so moving, and it's so well played because it has this real quality of when you're crying about something and then someone cracks a joke and you briefly laugh and then you go back to crying and that's so real. I like the overall tragedy of all these relationships, of Marcus's, love for her that was unrequited, and also the fact that we know on some level that he was kind of looking for a cause to die for, and there was a tendency there to begin with. Obviously, it's not ideal with the fifth season, and Straczynski has said that obviously it would not have played out this way had he known, and he would have kept Marcus, obviously, and had Ivanova die. It also brings back the device from season 1 again.
Yes, which I appreciate, as always, taking your world seriously. I'm always a fan of. And they took it so seriously that they also tried very hard to explain why it had not been used since. So it was like, it really did a good job of trying to keep the world plausible by both bringing back things in the way that you think they would and also making it clear why they were not used in other circumstances. So very, very high marks for that.
And the scene in which the accident, so to speak, happens that almost kills Ivanova, that really worked for me very well because they're hit by a piece of debris after they've won.
Yes.
and that, I don't know why, but that moment creeps me out very much. It's almost like seeing a car crash or something. It's this, because it's not all heroics, this, that. It's, yeah, we actually did it, and they just, because of all the chaos,
yes,
didn't manage to respond to something completely
mundane,
almost mundane. Yeah, exactly. And then this immense tragedy out of nowhere, and that's exactly what it is, right? You step out onto the street, one time you forget to look,
yeah,
and suddenly family tragedy,
yeah, yeah.
and it has that quality to it, and that's powerful. And then, okay, Sheridan kind of, Clark kills himself. I think this is all kind of business. It's not that important. They free Earth, and they kind of compromise on a lot of things, right?
Yeah. And we actually see, so we've seen twice, maybe I should mention one thing, for the benefit of people who, just so they know that I do yell at the screen sometimes. Like, before we move on from the battle to save Earth, I have to say that I think one of the only times in Babylon 5 where I was actively angry about something in the writing happens in that scene. And it doesn't bother me about the show as a whole because it was completely inconsequential, but I was like, what happened here? And that is that, like, at one point during this battle, at the very end, there's just nonsensical space battle nonsense. I one of the things I really hate is when you create drama out of something procedural, and the procedural thing is obviously nonsense. And I see this sort of thing happen fairly frequently, and thankfully Babylon 5 has been, like, mercifully free of it. Like in most of the things where there are giant space battles or whatever, nothing hinges on some technicality that is obviously stupid or wouldn't have really, right? Like, they mostly stay away from that, whereas a lot of space shows, I mean, Star Trek is like every episode has, like, something like this where you're just like, wait, what? Like, if that was a thing in the universe, you wouldn't have, wait, why is that part of the drama? That's terrible, right? And nobody else seems to mind but me. But Babylon 5 did this once, and specifically it was that there's this giant battle, and there's, like, I mean, there are so many ships in this battle. There are White Star ships that can circle planets in a split second, flying all over the place. Earth battle cruisers, all kinds of crazy, like, assorted assistant alien races are there around just Earth, which is not even a particularly big planet. And yet, at the end of the battle, we are supposed to believe that one particular satellite is going to fire on Earth.
I knew you would say that. Yeah.
The only person who is close enough to do something about it is Captain Sheridan's ship, and they have no other ordnance left, so the only thing they can do is ram it, which already I find incredibly implausible because the Earth Force ships are the slowest, most boat-like ships, whereas there's all these much faster, much more powerful vessels clearly in the immediate vicinity. But okay, even if I was to buy that, the resolution to this problem is not that they have to ram the satellite and suffer the consequences, but rather that an unrelated, identical vessel comes out of hyperspace and is able to get to the thing faster with their weaponry because their weaponry is still armed. And I'm just like, how is that possible that a ship not in the battle can warp there in time, but none of the other ships could? It's nonsense. I was like, it's yelling at the screen. I was like, this is terrible.
It is just
pure cheating.
An attempt to add a small moment of heroism to cap out the battle.
Anyway.
And
I don't even care about it, but I just wanted to yell.
No. It does. Again, I kind of shrug at it rather than scream at it. But it is something that's a little television-y in a way that the show rarely is.
Yes. And that was probably the only reason I was yelling at the screen, because a lot of times, I'm watching Star Trek. You just that happens at minute 37. Right, in a Star Trek episode. You just know that will occur. So you're just inoculated when it happens. You're just like, yeah, well,
whatever happens, the Enterprise is the only ship within range.
Yes. Or that we find out a new thing about the dilithium crystals that we didn't know before and that will never be mentioned again, but that's just, what happens, right?
Yeah.
But like I said, Babylon 5, one of the reasons I enjoy the show so much is that this doesn't happen. I think that's why I was angry about it, because I was like, no, not you too, right? Like, was kind of what I was saying.
Yeah, it's a slightly silly moment.
Anyway, but moving on. It doesn't matter because it doesn't affect. One of the nice things about it is I can forgive it very easily because it's inconsequential. You just pretend it never happened, and it has no bearing on anything else.
The plot doesn't hinge on
Nothing
it. At least it's not one of those where only you can save us due to the most ridiculous circumstances that anyone has ever heard.
Yes. So I'm just going to pretend that a different White Star ship just cruised in and blew that thing up for us, and then we're done. And now we move on. Okay, so yes, but continue. So you were about to talk about the compromises that they make, because and I think I was going to say we've seen multiple times the suggestion that there are many power brokers dealing with what happens on Earth. We saw this when Garibaldi fell in with the sort of the oligarchs there, how they sort of at least claimed to be running things behind the scenes much more so than you would think. Like, President Clark is only temporary. We will take care of him at the opportune time. The same thing is suggested again by sort of the senator, I want to say, who assumes control. Who I don't know exactly what her position was, but
yeah, I mean, she becomes president.
She becomes president.
What her
yeah.
exact.
She sort of suggests the same thing, I guess is what I'm saying, that multiple people sort of suggest they had a lot of power behind the scenes and were waiting for an opportune moment, or you know what I'm saying.
Yes, and the thing is that what does Sheridan do? He restores democracy, but he restores a democracy that we know was corrupt.
Mm-hmm.
So he restores freedom of speech and all of these things. And by the way, one of my favorite scenes in the entire damn show is when the reporter comes back on.
Yes.
Her name Maggie Egan, I think,
right.
is the actress. Anyway, but she comes back on, and she's basically just been let out of prison,
yes.
and she talks, and she's actually so moved that she kind of stops, and she has trouble getting through her lines a little bit. And it's very, very moving.
Yeah,
it's also the equivalent scene in Severed Dreams when they shut down the television channel by force is one of the creepiest fucking things I've ever seen. It's very, very frightening because very, very real.
In a way, it's real, but only anachronistically real, which is one interesting thing too. Like one of the things that the writers of the show couldn't probably have known is that, a scant 20 years in the future, actually almost no journalists who have a network broadcast would have any compunctions about selling a party line, right? Like the way the journalists fall in Babylon 5 is very much thinking about what a journalist might have been in 1970 and not at all about what a journalist is in 2020. The people who would have been imprisoned would have been, more dissident journalists. They would have had a Julian Assange character or something. I mean? And so it's interesting it was very interesting to see that anachronistic view of journalism, I guess is what I would say.
Yes, it is a much more positive view of things that are very rare at all on the planet right now. There might be a handful here and there, but certainly not in the major Western countries.
Yes.
Not anymore. We did see the kind of destruction of journalism over several years, but it was not as violent. It was much more just firing the right people and getting in other people who, were willing to compromise. But nevertheless, it is a very moving scene. And Sheridan frees Mars. Mars becomes independent, and Sheridan forms the Interstellar Alliance. So that's very interesting. He compromises on the Earth front. He allows Earth to return to its former corruption, but he kind of tries to change things around it and build new systems around it. And this is very interesting to me in regards to the next episode.
Because I guess you might say that in a way it doesn't really work. I don't know if I want to say
it doesn't.
It doesn't. Yeah, the Earth. He kind of is like Earth is kind of just going to collapse in a way. Is sort of what we're saying.
Exactly. In Deconstruction of Falling Stars, obviously again very postmodernism critical episode there.
Yes.
Very relevant to the present moment when suddenly we've decided to destroy the statues not only of people who are genuinely awful, but of revolutionary heroes who did really actually change the world for the better. Whatever flaws they had, if you look back at some things that these people accomplished, they're remarkable.
Yes.
Anyway, so Deconstruction of Falling Stars starts zooming out further and further, showing us the future.
Yes.
Showing us like 100 years, and then I've forgotten what the numbers are, honestly.
Yeah, I don't remember the exact numbers, but they show a couple. They show some. I thought this episode was pretty interesting, actually. I don't know that I was totally on board with all of the way it was played, but yeah, I definitely liked the point. And so anyway, please continue. Sorry.
Yeah. So we see a future in which first of all we see an authoritarian future on Earth.
Yes.
In like 100 years or something, where there's another civil war, but it's on Earth. It's not. Across the universe, the galaxy, or whatever. It's just Earth itself has sunken back into authoritarianism,
which I think appropriately shows Garibaldi's virtual, mentality being the one to primarily subvert that, since that does seem appropriate. Like, Garibaldi is the anti-authoritarian person, right?
Yes. I quite like the idea, and I find it actually kind of touching that you would create an AI of Garibaldi, and that would be such a bad idea that he would fuck with you. That even just a recreated dead Garibaldi is quite dangerous.
Yes. I thought so too. I liked that a lot.
Like, after his own death, in a way, he still is a menace to them.
Yes.
And that it was a tremendous mistake to try and do that. I like that a lot. I'm also one of the lines that kills me every time I watch it is just before the bombs drop at the end and Earth bombs itself back to the Stone Age. He turns to the other AIs, the other recreations of his dead friends, knowing that he himself is dead, and says, "Rest easy, friends." That kills me every time I watch it. It kills me now. It's so powerful. It's so moving. And then we see the future on Earth where it's kind of medieval.
It reminded me of the Canticle for Leibowitz.
Yes, very much. But the interesting thing is that at the end you realize that the Rangers still exist and the Alliance still exists, and they're trying to rebuild Earth.
There's a great humorous thing there where he's asking them to bring something that he needs to kind of like subtly seed some progress, and he's complaining about how they didn't sufficiently weather like age the previous thing they sent down so everyone could sort of see that it was new. And he's like, what you guys gotta do better here when you're sending me ancient props, right? Like that
was very, very cool. And of course we also see this discussion on television, essentially, between a host and a couple of historians on the 100th anniversary of the Interstellar Alliance.
Yes.
And that is where we really go into this idea of, the postmodern view of history, where we deconstruct the possibility of changing things. We look at everything and we kind of, we criticize it in a ahistorical manner, quite deliberately, to essentially tell you that nothing has a point, nothing can ever be done, and everything is bad and everyone is bad, rather than they were people of their time, they acted at that time. But that's how we get here. It's the kind of argument of like, well, Greek democracy, ancient Athenian democracy, they didn't allow women to vote. It's
right.
Yeah, man, but nobody else had democracy.
Yeah.
You
make each step one at a time. Nobody can just show up and be like, here's the entire moral future, and we just instantiated it with a wave of our wand, poof, right? Like, that doesn't happen.
And you make a million criticisms of a figure like Abraham Lincoln, because there are many parallels, obviously, to the Civil War. But it's like, if you read actual historical works about that time period, the act of freeing the slaves is so monumental purely on an economic level. It is so radical. And you can a funny thing is that you have people nowadays who claim to be like left wing and they're like, oh, all of this is bad.
Yeah.
But you read Marx, and Marx was a fan of Abraham Lincoln. Marx wrote to Abraham Lincoln, and
Really?
and Lincoln was like, yeah, wow, this is really cool. I'm really glad that these people approve of what we're doing. And Marx wrote about this in as like, this is the best of the bourgeoisie. This is the best of capitalism, bringing freedom to the world, doing something actually good. It's compromised in a million ways, but nevertheless, here you have people using the power that's been given to them to act upon the world in a very radical way. And that's admirable. And to him, obviously, there was a next step, which was socialism, and other people can see this in other ways. But the idea, nevertheless, that steps forward are possible.
Yeah.
And they'll never be taken by perfect people. Obviously, and when we look back, surely we will also appear in many ways, even the things that you and I believe, we think, oh, we're very, we really have things figured out. Yeah, we probably have some really dumb ideas from the perspective of 1,000 years later, if humanity manages to, evolve further to keep going. And at the same time, yeah, we can look at people of all kinds of ages who have accomplished something, and we'll say they believed this, that was stupid. They believed that was ridiculous. And yet, in the context of their time, they did things that were incredibly important. They sacrificed a lot to do those things, sometimes their lives. And without them, we don't get to where we are now, where we can say, oh, they were wrong about this or that. And so that's what this is very much about with Sheridan, that they're critical of him. And some of the criticisms are probably legit, but they portray him as this purely megalomaniacal person who was this is a very common trope in a lot of academic writing in the 90s. And by now it's kind of, become also a mainstream kind of idea. But back then it was more in the academy. But this idea, this person was just doing it all for power, for, to make himself famous, to do this or that. When we know, if you actually study history, there were people who fought for things that they believed in.
Well, also, I guess I would take issue with even the underlying premise, which is that we should care. The important part is whether the thing got accomplished, because the only alternative at the time was not having the thing. Like, there wasn't like some other, at the time that the Civil War was fought, there wasn't some other thing happening that was that without the downsides. So you can either choose to take the historical situation that got you the thing you wanted and accept the negative consequences, or you can have nothing, is the two choices when looking at history, that you don't get to. So it's unclear exactly what these criticisms are designed to do, because if you think about them from that perspective, I would actually take an even more negative view of it than you are. Your view is already fairly negative, I guess I would say, but I'd take an even more negative one, which is to say that it almost just feels like an arrogant sort of wanting to somehow make yourself feel better about, like, especially as an academic whose lives are largely inconsequential, to make yourself feel better about the fact that somebody in history actually got something done. It's like you have to minimize that accomplishment because of, I don't know why, or to make your life feel more justified by removing any notion that the individual in history has the ability to change things, so you don't have to feel bad about the fact that all you're doing is criticizing dead people. I don't know. I see it as a very negative thing that is being done there
for
sure,
because it's also, you really are defending the status quo, i.e. the people who pay your bills, by convincing everyone that changing the status quo is not really feasible at all. So it is a form of propaganda, really.
Yes.
And it's always portrayed as very radical. These people also portray themselves as kind of radical, but it is actually a very reactionary tendency,
I would agree,
in a lot of ways, because also of what the criticisms are like, and how they are deliberately kind of weaponized, because you can obviously criticize people, and that's actually what I want to get to. The thing is, we can step back and look at Sheridan as a historical actor, and I think we are encouraged to, and to see his limitations as a historical actor, not as a person. As a person, it's what Delenn, very, very movingly, I think, says is he was a good man, and he basically tried to do what he could with what he was given.
Yes.
Even though he was not appreciated for it, he did everything that he could to make the world a better place. But of course, we can step also back and look at this as a work of history. And there, I think a lot of the things that have that have been set up across the seasons really play into this, which is, yeah, Sheridan is kind of apolitical. Sheridan, on some level, wanted to, just defend democracy, restore the status quo, but the status quo was corrupt to begin with. President Clark was not an accident. It was the oligarchs who placed him there, and they just basically got out of control. He was just a puppet who got a little bit too full of himself.
Yeah.
But what Sheridan does, and for example, some of the people on Mars clearly have more radical beliefs. Some of the Mars freedom movement, and they wanted, the entire presidency to be abolished and so on, which is why they tell them, no, we just really want to abolish President Clark. And maybe some of them were right. I mean, some of them also idiotic terrorists, but the fact is that the problems on Earth are not fixed at the end of this war.
Right. Yes.
And they ultimately come back. And I mean, the question is, on the one hand, it is Sheridan's fault, like in the sense that he didn't go further when maybe he had the power to. Like his instinct to compromise with EarthGov at the end of the war, I think, can be criticized. I'm not going to say it's something as simplistic as it's wrong or it's good or it's bad, but I think it does need to be criticized or thought about, because he doesn't get at the roots of the problem at all.
Right.
But on the other hand, he starts building these alliances and other structures that are necessary at this political stage of the galaxy. And on the other hand, you can also say, yeah, okay, but it's not just his responsibility. It is also the responsibility of coming generations. And it is clear that on Earth, there is just a failure of other people also to fight back sufficiently and to draw the right conclusions from what happened before. And as a result, eventually, Earth is still plunged into darkness.
And I would say that feels like a pretty honest assessment. That is also what more or less happened in the U.S. with relation to the United Nations in a lot of ways. It's like we sort of made a half-hearted attempt at saying we were going to become this more global, way of organizing the world to eliminate conflict and all these sorts of things, and it didn't really work for a variety of reasons. I mean, right? And it's like it feels very honest that the first time you try that, it probably won't. It's unlikely that you'll get it right. And
you can't say that the Interstellar Alliance kind of works.
It kind of works, yes.
It kind of works. Like on a larger scale, it works, but there is a cost, a failure, which is Earth.
Yes.
Because the root of the problems is not really addressed, and we've seen those problems in detail since season 1. We've seen this kind of nativist kind of anti-alien sentiment and all of these things, and behind a lot of it is the capital and the problem that you have these oligarchs who can just run the show, and since Sheridan is unwilling or unable to address it, it's still there. But at the same time, you can't just dismiss him.
Well, it's also a sovereignty problem. And I've always thought this was a really critical problem, not, again, to get into like actual world stuff, which is harder to talk about, I suppose, because it's much more nebulous. But I do, in general, dual sovereignty things create a lot of problems. Like if you say, well, we're going to have Earth and it's going to have its own, army and its own ruling class and its own all this stuff, and then we're also going to have this like separate thing that's sort of another sovereign but doesn't really have control of the military, and it doesn't really have authority over the courts, and so like these things don't work very well. Like sovereignty is kind of a Boolean thing, and one of the ways that humanity traditionally over time has been able to reduce conflict is by creating larger and larger sovereigns. And at some level, if what you do is sort of say, well, we're going to keep the sovereignty and we're sort of going to have a nominal body that we go to, these things tend to fall apart. They just, because it's not a real sovereign. For sure. It's not a real sovereign. And it doesn't have a monopoly on violence like a normal sovereign does.
And there are big democratic questions, certainly, that the show doesn't address.
Right.
Okay, whatever. Like, I mean, I, as someone who is very critical of the EU, for example, because of sovereignty issues, because of democratic issues and imposing things on member states that I find extremely anti-democratic.
Yes.
As you saw very well with Greece, as I think the most famous example, but nevertheless.
Well, and you see both times, right? The UN is an example of somebody who doesn't end up getting taken seriously, and it fails that way. The EU
has no real authority.
The EU is an example of something that does have real authority, but doesn't actually have the other elements you want in a sovereign, like actual good representation, citizens who can buy into it.
No system for citizens to actually democratically control.
You can see how these like dual sovereignty systems, they create lots of problems, and well, anyway, continue.
Yeah. But in the case of this, I find it interesting because we see Sheridan's triumphs. We see that, yes, he helped prevent the galaxy from destroying itself. He and many others. It's not just him. But since, it is kind of about his role as an individual, he was a good person. He did what he could. And he built something that lasted ultimately.
Yes.
That's clear. He built something that ultimately lasted. It wobbled. It had issues. It didn't succeed on every level. But it did, in the long run, do well. But at the same time, his limitations as a politician caused what happened on Earth, or at least I can argue that way. Yes. Other people might say, well, it's not his fault. It's the fault of people on Earth.
Sure.
Right? But what I find then interesting about Babylon 5 is that I can have this conversation about him as a historical figure. Because in every other show, I feel it's that, he blew up Earth because his cousin was on Earth and he doesn't like his cousin. Everything is rendered entirely personal. And in a way, the show almost divides those things because the personal is not always political. And he was a good man and he did what he could. And at the same time, he had political limitations. And we can interpret this in different ways because we're just presented with an invented history, and we can look at it on these multiple levels of the historical and also the personal.
And I think his limitations make sense. Like, he is a military person raised in the military. It makes sense that he would not be politically shrewd in the way that you would need to be to fix some of those things that you're talking about. That's not his background. So it also feels authentic to the character. Like, his failings in this way line up with what you would expect his life experiences to have allowed him to know how to do in a way.
Yeah, exactly. And that's what I find so wonderful and so rare, this perspective that the show has, and the way that these people are produced by their circumstances. They're produced by the historical circumstances into which they were born. They have the ideas. Londo has the ideas of someone who was born into this decaying culture and so on. And of course, they fight against that and they try to become enlightened. G'Kar changes and understands new things that are beyond what he was born as. But nevertheless, they exist in history, as do all of us. If we lived in 300 BC, we would have very different beliefs than we do now because we would have simply been exposed to completely different ideas. And the show ultimately has also a lot of sympathy for this, which I find also very crucial to understand that people do their best in difficult circumstances in the moments they find themselves in, and it's not so simple to just look back at. You can easily look back at some very bad people, but you can look at people who did good things and see they also failed on some levels, and you can have some sympathy for them as individuals while criticizing them politically, which are two separate things.
Well, and it's also a case. I think it matters what you're trying to do. If one of the reasons that you want to look back at a historical figure and analyze where they went wrong is so that we can learn how to do it better going forward, that seems like a very worthwhile endeavor. If your goal is just because you don't want other people to like the fact that this political figure did something, that just seems fundamentally defeatist and ultimately failure to accept how flawed human beings are, including the people who are probably making these criticisms.
Yeah, exactly.
So, sorry, go ahead.
Of course, I just wanted to mention, and of course, at the end, we do see, at the very end of that episode, we do see that in the long run, humanity will make it.
That's exactly what I was just going to say. It's like the end of that episode is like saying, well, in the end, eventually we figure out how to ascend, because that's the very last thing that you see happen.
Yeah, and again, it's moving and beautiful because it is this idea that it mattered what these people did, because this zoom out really shows you now that, you know, these people had these brief lives like we all do. Yes. They were a blip in history, but they found themselves at a moment when things could have gone in different directions.
Yes.
And they chose to fight. And it's not all going to be perfect because of that, but it is better. And in the long run, because of people like that, not just them, but many others, presumably, who had similar fights across history. Yes, because we're watching a 5-year sort of segment, but others fought the same other battles. And because of that, in the long run, we managed to ascend as a species. And that is very powerful to me, very beautiful.
I would, since we're coming to the end here, I would also maybe end the discussion almost back where we began, and say, in all of this, there is also, so when they are creating the UN at the very end, there is a, well, it's not really when they're creating the UN. I shouldn't say that. It's actually more when they're amassing the fleet to do the final push to depose President Clark. We are treated to sort of our last great Londo G'Kar scene, and I would be remiss if I didn't mention it, because like I said before, like these are two of my favorite characters in the series. Their performances are they start out being pretty good performances in season 1, but by the time you get to season 4, they are both so good at playing these parts that it's absolutely fantastic to watch them do basically anything. There's a scene where Londo Mollari attempts to apologize to G'Kar. I don't know if you know which scene I'm talking about. He wants to pour him a drink, and I thought this scene was so fantastic because, again, basically nothing happens in this scene. It is a non-scene. There is no real plot occurring here. But because you know so much about these characters and what they've been through and what you've seen of what it takes for each of them to do what they do, it was just absolutely fantastic to watch. And the way that it was portrayed was, I thought, was flawless, really. I absolutely enjoyed it. Every last bit of it. And I point that out only because I think it underscores for me just how valuable something you mentioned was the amount of time you get to spend in a series like this, where you have so many episodes, not just 10, but 22, and you've by now gone through 4 times 22, or somewhere in that order, something on the order of 60 plus episodes, 70 plus episodes by the time you get to this one. You can't have a scene like this. Scene would have been completely uninteresting in season 1. You have no idea why you would care about this scene, but by the time you get to it here, it's just absolutely perfect, and there's no other way you could have done it, right?
Yeah. That's the beauty of really getting to dive into this world and these people, and the performances every time they're on, especially on screen with each other.
Yes.
There's like 1,000 layers at the same time, all moving against each other, all these past scenes and histories and and these performances become so nuanced. It's very rare to see something like that.
They amusingly at the end end up being friends, not in this scene, but it also leads to another one of the great lines. G'Kar, for comedy purposes, G'Kar is eating rice that has been thrown at a wedding ceremony. Do you remember this? He's eating it,
yes.
and he's like, "This is really good." And Londo is just like horrified at this because he didn't approve of the way the ceremony was conducted in the first place. Thinks that's silly. He thinks getting married should be a tragic affair because it's horrible. Like, right? Like that was one of his things. And then he has this line where he says, if it was any good. If rice was any good, do you think they'd just throw it at ceremonies, right? Like it was great. Anyway, so we could go to closing thoughts now, but I wanted to get those scenes in there because while all the rest of the Imaginations is happening, mostly Mollari and G'Kar are not really involved, but they do have a few remaining scenes, and the scenes are fantastic. We only get like 2 or 3 of them, but they're all absolutely spectacular.
Yeah, they are, that relationship, and that's one of the things that still carries over into season 5. Despite, I would say season 5 is by far the most flawed season.
Yes, you mentioned that.
Yeah. But it had, and the thing is, some people are like, oh, season 5, I don't know, skip it, something nonsense. Like, yes, there's episodes all over the place that are weak. There's things that just don't work in the presentation here and there. Yeah. But the ongoing relationship between those two, and then the last few episodes, and then moments all throughout are so remarkable. G'Kar especially has some incredible moments.
They've gotten so good at playing those characters that, like, I suspect I would have a similar reaction in season 5. So maybe I won't like a bunch of stuff, but like seeing those characters do just about anything at this point, they're just so good at it that I have a hard time believing I won't like those parts at least.
Yeah, exactly. There's so much to enjoy there. So, and yeah, I can keep going on and on about this because I see this so rarely that I'm so invested in these characters, and they have such layers to them.
Yes.
That they're people.
Yes.
And I wish I could see that more often, and I do wish I could see shows that could take the time to do this.
I always wondered, like, do people not like this? Like, so one of the things that I also don't know is, does anyone else care about this stuff? Like, were people just like, oh yeah, the whole like Londo Veer Emperor stuff was just boring, I wanted more space battles, because I don't know to what extent a show like Star Trek Picard is the way it is because they're trying to serve an audience that simply doesn't want characters to be interesting or have conflict or any of that sort of stuff. Or is it that the writers suck and the audience would actually have wanted a good series? And I just don't know, because like audiences age. I'm old. I'm not 20 anymore, and I don't know. I just fundamentally don't know who's primarily driving that. Is it that audiences have gotten worse and so therefore the writing gets worse, or is it the writing is bad and audiences would clamor for something that was actually good? I don't know.
I think it's tricky, and it's not just one thing.
Probably. Yeah.
I think definitely it's not easy reaching audiences with something good.
Yeah.
There is an anti-intellectualism. There is a tendency. I mean, I don't know, Babylon 5 got a lot of weird, like, I don't know. Like the geek world, there was a tendency to hate Babylon 5. There's running jokes on several, geek comedies about how Babylon 5 sucks.
Really?
There was a weird kind of hostile sentiment, but at the same time, it does have a lot of fans, and people can enjoy it. And to what degree is it that the show, it was hard to find, ran at random times? Like, if we have a mainstream, a cultural mainstream that only has crap pumped into it, and all the good stuff is, in the margins, then audiences will degrade because they only ever see crap. Like,
Yeah.
if all you've ever watched is Marvel movies, yeah, you might not have the palate to appreciate something, something better than a Marvel movie. Which is why I was always fine when there were a few superhero movies, but when it's wall to wall, then I think it starts changing what we're used to. But of course, if better stuff had bigger audiences, it might be easier to to actually make it and sell it and be able to do that. And I think it's a complicated relationship, and it was never easy to produce good stuff for big audiences, but at the same time, the fact that what is produced has degraded so much for economic reasons, for everything is run by managers, there's no artistic freedom, that then has an effect on audiences, which has an effect, it kind of ping pongs back and forth. And I think we've entered a very, very bad place this way, for a variety of reasons, where there's a lot of money being thrown at television, but the quality certainly is not what I would like it to be. There are things that I love still, but they're very rare.
Yeah, and it seems like we are at a time where a tremendous amount of money is being thrown at shows, but we're not getting very much of quality. I mean, the visual quality has improved dramatically with technology and all that sort of stuff, obviously. I mean, the typical camera that even a consumer can buy nowadays can shoot much better than the cameras that Babylon 5 had to work with, for example. So there are obviously elements of progress, but writing doesn't seem to be one of them.
Yes, because for many reasons, including a lack of freedom to do what you want, because so much is micromanaged and by people who really have no understanding of storytelling. And Babylon 5 was created in the margins. It was created, on a very low budget, under very weird circumstances, far away, even like physically far away from the mainstream, so to speak.
That's true.
And so sometimes I think shows can almost slip through the cracks in these ways. It's something that I think about a lot, because I'm very invested in this. I really like this experience very much. I love this kind of serial storytelling, visual storytelling. It's in a way, I like it more than I like films, and I like films a great deal. But when it's done right, it's something that really sweeps me sort of up, and really, I can really be sort of transported into this world. And I would love to have that experience more, because I feel that it enriches my own life. It gives me strength to keep going when I find the world very, very hostile and strange and incomprehensible. But it does seem very, very difficult. And yeah, that's a whole other discussion unto itself. I'm just kind of grateful for what we get.
Well, on that note, Jonas, thanks so much for coming back for season 4. And I will start watching season 5 now, so we can conclude our Babylon. I guess I won't be going into it with high expectations, because you've already said that you thought it was, a season that had problems. But I am interested to see what the remaining parts of the season show. So we'll be back here for season 5. Can't exactly say when, but probably it doesn't seem to take me too long to go through these. So.
No, it really doesn't.
All right.
It's been a pleasure.
Absolutely. And thank you so much again for taking the time. I love talking about these seasons. There's just a lot to talk about, because even when the show is at its worst, there's a lot to talk about, which is, I think, part of the reason why it's so interesting. But so thank you so much for joining me, and then thank you everyone at home for joining us. Until next time on Babylon, take it easy, everybody.